Some crimes begin with anger, some with desperation, but this one began with desire. The kind that rewires judgment, pulls men across state lines, and makes them believe a single object can rewrite their lives. Vera Krupp wore a diamond unlike any other, 33 carats. D color, type 2A, the stone so pure it didn't just shine. It triggered something in the people who saw it. Ranch hands noticed it, visitors whispered about it, and in the quiet spaces of Nevada, word of the jewel drifted into the wrong ears. What happened next unfolded in minutes. A knock at her door, a violent intrusion, a ring ripped from her hand, and a getaway car disappearing into the desert. But the real story didn't begin with the theft. It began after. The thieves didn't understand the weight of what they stole. A diamond that rare can't be hidden. It exposes motives, fractures loyalties, and turns small-time criminals into fugitives trapped inside their own panic. Over the next weeks, that single stone would travel from Nevada to Louisiana, from cheap motels to crowded highways, from a coat lining in New Jersey to a jeweler's bench in Missouri. Men would scatter, betray one another, and leave behind a trail that agents could follow almost by instinct. Because fear has patterns, and panic leaves fingerprints. And when the last arrests were made, the jewel that triggered the violence wouldn't vanish into the underworld. It would rise even higher, onto the hand of one of the most famous women on earth. This is the true story of a diamond that refused to disappear, a crime that stretched across America, and the psychological unraveling of the men who thought they could steal something priceless and get away with it. The story of the Krupp Diamond began long before anyone in the Nevada desert ever heard its name. It emerged from the earth as a rough crystal of exceptional purity, a type 2A stone formed under conditions so rare that only a fraction of 1% of diamonds share its pedigree. When cutters shaped it into a 33 19-carat Asher-cut gem in the early 20th century, they revealed a clarity that bordered on spectral, D-color, VS1, with a geometric discipline that allowed light to move through it without distortion. The stone's facets were arranged in sharp, methodical tiers, each catching illumination with a precision that left jewelers describing it as almost unnaturally clean. In the decades that followed, the diamond remained within circles of privilege, wealth, and industrial influence, eventually finding its way into the possession of the Krupp family, one of the most powerful dynasties in Germany. By the time it reached the hand of Vera von Endicott Krupp, it already carried the weight of European industry and wartime history, an object shaped not only by craftsmen, but by the political tide that swept through mid-century Europe. Vera Krupp wore the stone in a ring, designed to emphasize its cold brilliance. Two tapered baguettes flanked the primary diamond, turning the piece into a statement of dominance as much as decoration. She had been an actress in her youth, then the wife of industrialist Alfred Krupp, whose name was synonymous with steel production, armaments, and the machinery of the German war effort. Their marriage ended long before she relocated to the American Southwest. But the diamond remained with her, surviving tribunals, public scrutiny, and political upheaval. In the United States, she carved out a quieter life, far removed from the factories and courtrooms that had once surrounded the Krupp empire. In Nevada, the ring became simply an expression of personal identity, something she wore daily without hesitation or concern for what it represented elsewhere in the world. Her home, Spring Mountain Ranch, sat 26 miles southwest of Las Vegas, positioned in Red Rock Canyon's rugged basin. The property was visually striking, but geographically exposed. Broad open land stretched outward in every direction, framed by desert mountains and weather-carved rock formations. Dirt roads lined with sagebrush and dry riverbeds defined the landscape around the ranch house, a low building set back from the main road and reachable only by long driveways. The isolation appealed to Vera. After years of public scrutiny in Europe, she welcomed the quiet, the anonymity, and the freedom to live without constant surveillance or speculation. The ranch allowed her to move through her days with minimal intrusion, accompanied only by a small staff and the foreman who oversaw daily operations. Yet the same qualities that drew her there also made the property vulnerable. Visitors rarely appeared unannounced, and when someone did, the residents could not depend on nearby neighbors or rapid law enforcement intervention. By the late 1950s, criminal activity across the American Southwest had evolved into a fluid, mobile enterprise. The expansion of interstate highways and the ease of crossing state boundaries allowed organized theft rings to exploit gaps between jurisdictions. Crimes were committed in one state, merchandise moved through another, and suspects vanished into a third before police departments even coordinated basic information. Jewelry thefts, safe burglaries, and armed robberies grew increasingly sophisticated. Rings of thieves moved in caravans or small units, traveling from city to city, in search of affluent or isolated targets. Their planning was simple but effective. They watched for routines, measured risk, and struck quickly. The FBI observed this trend with rising concern, noting that criminals no longer relied on complex schemes. Mobility was their greatest asset. Once they left the state where a crime occurred, the pursuit became exponentially more difficult. Spring Mountain Ranch presented the exact type of opportunity these thieves sought. A wealthy resident, a valuable possession known locally, and a property far from immediate police presence. Vera wore the ring openly. Neighbors, tradesmen, and ranch visitors recognized it easily. Jewelers in Las Vegas had seen it when she brought it in for cleaning. Its reputation spread through casual conversation and curiosity. People commented on its size and clarity, describing it even to those who had never met her. Over time, the Krupp Diamond shifted from being a private heirloom to a regional point of fascination. It was known that she wore it not only at events, but during regular daily activities, driving the property, hosting visitors, or completing ranch tasks. The visibility of the ring made it a tempting target for thieves who relied on accessible, high-value items that could be fenced quickly or transported across state lines. The trio who eventually targeted her belonged to a wider network that had drifted through the Southwest. In early 1990s, they moved between Nevada and California with little consistency, staying in budget motels or using connections to secure temporary lodging. Their interest in the diamond emerged gradually as they observed the ranch and gathered information through intermediaries. They learned that Vera lived with minimal security, relying on distance rather than guards or alarm systems. They saw that her routines were predictable. They discovered that the ring was not locked away in a safe but worn constantly. These details shaped their plan, which depended on speed, intimidation, and the assumption that the remote setting would delay the arrival of law enforcement. In early April 1959, the trio began monitoring the ranch more closely. They approached the property under the guise of laborers, claiming experience in driveway surfacing. This ruse allowed them to move near the house without raising suspicion, to inspect the layout, and to test the household's response to strangers. They took note of the foreman's movements, the direction from which vehicles approached, and the likely points of entry. Their method required no elaborate tools. They needed only proximity, timing, and the confidence that they could overpower two individuals quickly enough to keep the operation silent. Inside the ranch house, the atmosphere during those days gave no indication of what was approaching. The interior reflected Vera's preference for comfort more than luxury. The decor mixed European taste with Southwestern sensibilities. Heavy furniture, wide windows overlooking the desert, and personal artifacts that suggested stability rather than ostentation. Photographs, small sculptures, and modest paintings filled the rooms. Nothing inside hinted that one of the most valuable diamonds in private ownership was kept on the property. To anyone unfamiliar with the ring's history, the house appeared ordinary, maintained by a small staff and running on the rhythms of ranch life. This contrast between the modest setting and the extraordinary jewel within it heightened the sense of exposure that investigators later noted when reviewing the crime. The desert around the ranch remained deceptively quiet during this period. The spring air carried the scent of dry earth and sun-baked rock. Migrating birds crossed the valley. Ranch hands continued daily chores, tending to livestock and maintaining the grounds. The world seemed unhurried, insulated from the turbulence of interstate crime patterns and the ambitions of the men who had already marked the property as their next target. Yet beneath the stillness, the ingredients of the crime were aligning. The thieves had observed enough to finalize their plan, and Vera remained unaware that her routine had become part of someone else's strategy. The criminal trio saw the isolation not as a deterrent, but as an open invitation. They recognized that an estate so far removed from municipal services offered a narrow window during which they could act without interruption. They relied on the assumption that the nearest law enforcement presence would take considerable time to respond to an emergency call. They also understood that the desert provided an immediate escape route. Dirt roads and unmarked paths extended in every direction, many of them connecting to state highways, miles from the ranch. If they moved quickly enough, they could be gone long before a deputy arrived. The landscape that offered Vera peace also offered the thieves concealment. Throughout the 1950s, the FBI had documented a rising trend of jewel theft rings that crossed state lines with increasing frequency. These groups dismantled valuable pieces to make them untraceable, removing stones from settings, altering metal bands, or scattering components across multiple cities. The Bureau understood that recovery became far more difficult once a stolen jewel was broken into parts or transported through intermediaries. In the case of the Krupp Diamond, its size and distinctiveness would make concealment harder, but not impossible. A single stone of its magnitude could be sewn into clothing, hidden in luggage, or transported by a courier who never went near the crime itself. The FBI awareness of this pattern later shaped how agents responded to the case, but in early April 1959, no one expected that the ring's long transcontinental journey would soon involve federal archives, multi-state pursuit, and courtroom battles. The ranch stood in a transitional moment between privacy and peril. Each day moved Vera closer to an event that would draw federal attention, link multiple states through a single crime, and transform the diamond into one of the most publicly recognized jewels of its era. The thieves prepared without haste, believing the target to be vulnerable, and the risk manageable. Their planning was not sophisticated, but it was deliberate. They were not professionals in the sense of highly trained operatives. They were opportunists navigating the loose structure of mid-century criminal networks, relying on instinct and mobility, rather than precision. As spring advanced, the patterns of ranch life continued uninterrupted. Vera moved through her home and property with the ease of someone who believed she had found a refuge from the complications of her past. She spent time walking the grounds, interacting with staff, and overseeing improvements to the estate. On certain days she visited Las Vegas, conducting errands or social engagements, before returning to the quiet of the ranch in the evening. Throughout the 1950s, the FBI had documented a rising trend of jewel theft rings that crossed state lines with increasing frequency. These groups dismantled valuable pieces to make them untraceable, removing stones from settings, altering metal bands, or scattering components across multiple cities. The Bureau understood that recovery became far more difficult once a stolen jewel was broken into parts or transported through intermediaries. In the case of the Krupp Diamond, its size and distinctiveness would make concealment harder, but not impossible. A single stone of its magnitude could be sewn into clothing, hidden in luggage, or transported by a courier who never went near the crime itself. The FBI awareness of this pattern later shaped how agents responded to the case. But in early April 1959, no one expected that the ring's long transcontinental journey would soon involve federal archives, multi-state pursuit, and courtroom battles. The ranch stood in a transitional moment between privacy and peril. Each day moved Vera closer to an event that would draw federal attention, link multiple states through a single crime, and transform the diamond into one of the most publicly recognized jewels of its era. The thieves prepared without haste, believing the target to be vulnerable, and the risk manageable. Their planning was not sophisticated, but it was deliberate. They were not professionals in the sense of highly trained operatives. They were opportunists navigating the loose structure of mid-century criminal networks, relying on instinct and mobility, rather than precision. As spring advanced, the patterns of ranch life continued uninterrupted. Vera moved through her home and property with the ease of someone who believed she had found a refuge from the complications of her past. She spent time walking the grounds, interacting with staff, and overseeing improvements to the estate. On certain days she visited Las Vegas, conducting errands or social engagements, before returning to the quiet of the ranch in the evening. The diamond remained on her finger throughout, catching the desert light with its icy brilliance. Its presence was so constant that those around her rarely thought of it as anything beyond her personal adornment. This sense of normalcy would soon be shattered, with a violence that made clear how precarious solitude could become when intersecting with criminal ambition. The convergence of elements, the remote ranch, the jewel's notoriety, the mobility of the thieves, and the era's fragmented law enforcement structure set the stage for one of the most widely publicized jewel thefts in American history. The FBI's involvement would come only after the crime, yet the conditions that made federal jurisdiction inevitable were already present. The thieves intended to move the diamond across state lines. They intended to use the vastness of the Southwest to hide their movements, and they intended to exploit the delays inherent in rural emergency response. What they did not anticipate was how quickly the ring's distinctiveness would work against them, drawing attention wherever it surfaced, and compelling federal resources to trace it with a determination equal to their desire to disappear. By the first week of April, the thieves were ready. Their observations were complete, their roles defined, and their understanding of the ranch's vulnerabilities firm. The moment they had selected for entry approached with quiet inevitability. The desert remained still, the ranch unchanged, and the diamond undisturbed on Vera's hand. Everything that followed, violence, pursuit, prosecution, and the diamond's transformation into one of Hollywood's most recognizable jewels, would flow from the events set into motion during these final calm days. The prologue lays out the elements before they collide: a rare diamond forged under intense geological pressure, a wealthy owner seeking peace in the Nevada desert, a property shaped by isolation, a group of mobile thieves capitalizing on the era's fractured jurisdiction, and a landscape vast enough to offer escape yet exposed enough to reveal every misstep. The crime that would soon occur was not inevitable, but it was the logical consequence of a world where wealth, remoteness, and lawlessness intersected with quiet precision. Within days, the serenity of Spring Mountain Ranch would shatter, and a jewel that had already survived the turbulence of European industrial history would enter a new chapter, one marked by violence, federal pursuit, and eventual rebirth under a new name. In the first days of April 1959, the men who would later be identified as part of a wider theft network moved through Nevada with the purposeful drifting common to mid-century interstate criminals. They stayed in roadside motels that offered anonymity rather than comfort, paying in cash, avoiding unnecessary conversation, and keeping their movements irregular enough to leave no consistent pattern behind them. Their names would eventually appear in FBI records: John William Hagenson, James George Reeves, Edward Daniel Hay, and the peripheral associates who orbited their activities. But during these early days, they were simply three men passing through a region where few strangers attracted attention. They traveled in a battered vehicle, carrying little more than clothes, tools, and the confidence of individuals accustomed to exploiting the open geography of the Southwest. Their approach to crime relied on observation, instinct, and the fluidity that came from not being tied to any one state, one job, or one routine. They spent their nights moving between Las Vegas and the surrounding desert highways, never lingering long enough to form patterns, but remaining close enough to immediate opportunity. The men understood the advantages offered by the region. Las Vegas produced wealth rapidly, drew people from every state, and maintained a tourism-driven economy that masked the presence of outsiders. Ranches, estates, and isolated properties surrounded the city, some owned by entertainers or wealthy transplants, others by individuals seeking refuge from urban life. Many of these properties lacked formal security systems, relying instead on long distances and rarely traveled access roads. This combination of wealth and isolation had already shaped the thieves' activities in California and Arizona, and it shaped their interest in Nevada now. Their attention turned to Spring Mountain Ranch through a chain of information, passed casually, rather than through any investigative sophistication. The ranch had been operating in the region long before Vera Krupp purchased it, and locals were familiar with the presence of a wealthy European woman living there with minimal staff. Service workers, delivery drivers, and tradesmen knew the property's location, its layout, and its distance from the nearest town. Some knew of the ring Vera wore constantly, a diamond so large and so distinct that even those unfamiliar with jewelry could describe its size and clarity. Within Las Vegas, rumors often circulated about who owned what, and the ring occupied a category of its own, impressive enough to be discussed, recognizable enough to be remembered, and distinctive enough to draw the attention of those who profited from high-value theft. The trio began by conducting slow, unobtrusive reconnaissance. Their method did not involve advanced surveillance equipment or intricate timing charts. Instead, they drove the road leading toward the ranch at different hours, familiarizing themselves with its curves, distance markers, and potential choke points. They noted the absence of frequent traffic, the lack of immediate neighbors, and the general silence surrounding the property. They observed how long it took to reach the ranch from the main road, calculated the approximate response time for law enforcement, and assessed whether any natural obstacles might interfere with a rapid escape. The desert offered a highway of its own: dirt trails, dry stream beds, and paths recognizable only to those accustomed to traveling them. For individuals who understood how vast terrain could obscure direction and movement, the region was more opportunity than risk. Their next step involved approaching the ranch under a pretext simple enough to appear harmless. Road crews were common in rural Nevada, especially at the time of year when winter damage required maintenance. Asphalt teams, gravel trucks, and independent laborers frequently offered driveway surfacing to ranch owners, either through legitimate contracts or opportunistic door-to-door offers. The thieves adopted this facade, using their clothing, tools, and practiced ease to present themselves as temporary workers, willing to offer inexpensive services. Their goal was not to gain entry that day, but to test visibility, routines, and the level of caution exercised by the residents. They needed to know how quickly someone answered the door, how many people might be inside, and whether any signs of weapons or alarm systems were visible. On their first pass, they approached slowly, parking where they could observe the front entrance, without appearing suspicious. A worker from the property crossed the yard, glanced toward them, then continued his task without concern. The men used the moment to assess the foreman's build, age, and general alertness. They watched the pace at which he moved, the confidence in his posture, and whether he lingered to gauge their presence. He did not. His lack of suspicion suggested to them that strangers arriving for maintenance work were not unusual on the property. On another approach, they drove past the ranch without stopping, taking note of the surrounding structures. The barns, storage sheds, and outbuildings that connected to the agricultural operation. They watched how the wind carried dust along the driveway, how sound traveled in the open air, and how long it took for someone to exit the house after their arrival. These inert observations formed the foundation of their plan. Unlike city crime, where alarms, locks, and rapid police response dictated the flow of events, rural theft required understanding silence, distance, and human routine. The thieves recognized that the remoteness of the ranch meant they would only need to move decisively, not elaborately. Meanwhile, inside the ranch house, Vera continued her normal schedule. She held no expectation of criminal threat, and had no reason to alter her behavior. The desert had become synonymous with safety, the isolation equating to privacy rather than vulnerability. She interacted with her staff, supervised small matters on the property, and wore the diamond ring as she always had, daily, without concealment. The stone sat prominently on her hand, its large asher-cut surface capturing the shifting desert light with its distinctive step facets. Even for those who knew nothing of its technical qualities, the ring carried a visual authority that drew attention. For the thieves watching from a distance, it represented a level of value that justified risk. As the days progressed, the men refined their approach. They began to study the patterns of vehicles coming and going from the property. They learned which hours were busiest, when deliveries typically arrived, and how often visitors appeared. Spring Mountain Ranch attracted some sightseers and occasional tourists, but early April offered fewer disruptions. The men concluded that evening presented the ideal moment for their strike, late enough that the ranch would be settled, early enough that they would still have darkness for their escape. They did not need complex timing to overpower two individuals. They only needed the confidence that the household would not be expecting violence. Their ruse, already tested, involved returning to the property and posing as driveway workers, seeking to speak to the owner. This excuse served multiple purposes. It justified their approach, reduced suspicion during the crucial moment when the door opened, and provided a casual reason for carrying tools that could later become improvised weapons. Their objective was not to stage a prolonged confrontation, but to create a rapid, forceful entry that would leave the victims disoriented long enough for the thieves to obtain what they sought. They anticipated resistance, but relied on surprise to minimize it. Their planning revolved around gaining immediate physical control and ensuring the victims could not summon help before the thieves completed their search. During this period, the men also considered how to handle the diamond once it was taken. They were aware that a stone of such magnitude could not be sold openly or quickly. Its uniqueness made it recognizable to jewelers, law enforcement, and anyone familiar with high-carat gems. Their strategy likely involved either removing the stone from its setting or transporting it through intermediaries across state lines before attempting to fence it. The risk of carrying it intact was significant, but they believed that if they concealed it effectively and moved swiftly, they could avoid detection long enough to reach a safer location. Their criminal experience had taught them that distance between the crime scene and the suspect often mattered more than the sophistication of the plan itself. Inside the ranch, no one suspected the quiet surveillance occurring beyond the property line. The foreman continued his duties, tending to maintenance tasks and overseeing workers. Vera went about her daily activities without any notion that she had become the central figure in someone else's intentions. Her trust in the environment was not naive. Rather, it was shaped by years of living in a region where privacy was a practical reality. She had experienced public scrutiny and personal upheaval in Europe. The simplicity of life in the Nevada desert offered a stark contrast, one she embraced fully. Her confidence in the safety of her surroundings would soon collide with the ambitions of men who saw vulnerability where she saw peace. The trio met periodically, in their car or in motel rooms, to finalize the sequence of events. They reviewed the approach, the entry, the binding of the victims, and the search of the house. They agreed on their escape route, choosing to leave the property by the same road they entered, then diverting into the desert to avoid detection. Each decision reflected their reliance on speed and instinct, rather than meticulous planning. They believed that once they had the diamond, law enforcement would face an uphill battle tracking them across multiple states. They also believed that if they acted decisively, they could complete the entire operation within minutes. By the time they were ready to act, the men felt confident in their understanding of the ranch's layout and routines. They had tested their cover story, mapped their escape, and assessed the risks. The next step required only execution. They chose April 10 as the date, not for symbolic reasons, but because it aligned with their observations of the property. They knew the ranch would be quiet that evening. They knew the foreman would likely be present, and they anticipated that controlling two people would prove manageable. They also believed that the remoteness of the ranch would delay the arrival of help, giving them a significant advantage. As the sun fell behind the desert mountains, on the evening chosen for the crime, the ranch appeared no different than it had on any other day. The wind moved through the valley, carrying dust across the open land. The temperature dropped slowly, cooling the air as darkness crept over the property. Inside the house, a sense of routine settled in, the same rhythm that had defined countless evenings before it. The desert remained still, offering no indication that the men who had been watching were now preparing to make their final approach. The thieves departed their motel just after dusk, driving toward the ranch with the same calm demeanor they had displayed during their earlier visits. The road ahead of them stretched in long, straight lines, illuminated only by their headlights, and the faint, residual glow of the day retreating over the mountains. They spoke little among themselves, each man rehearsing internally the steps they had agreed upon. Their confidence lay not in their precision, but in their expectation that the environment itself favored them. The vastness of the desert, the silence of the night, and the isolation of the property formed the backdrop against which they believed the operation would succeed. They turned onto the dirt road leading to the ranch, the vehicle's tires kicking up dust that hung briefly in the air before dissipating into the darkness. The ranch house came into view, its windows lit, revealing silhouettes of movement inside. The men slowed their vehicle near the entrance, the familiar approach helping to steady their nerves. They had been here before under the same pretext. This time, however, the encounter would not be casual. The plan they had shaped through days of observation and preparation had reached the point where observation ended and action began. Everything that would follow, violence, binding, the ripping of a diamond from its owner's hand, and a multi-state manhunt, had its origins in these quiet moments. At the edge of the property, the intruders had arrived, carrying with them the full weight of their intentions, ready to execute a crime that would soon echo across the country and enter federal archives as one of the most significant jewel thefts of its era. The desert night settled across Spring Mountain Ranch, with a calm that concealed the approaching rupture. April 10, 1959, moved toward evening without incident. The sun had already dipped behind the ridges, leaving behind a muted afterglow that thinned with every passing minute. Inside the ranch house, the atmosphere remained predictable. A quiet dinner shared between Vera and her longtime foreman, the soft clatter of dishes being cleaned, the final tasks of the day carried out with practiced efficiency. Nothing in the tone of the evening suggested that within moments, the property would become the center of a violent, calculated intrusion. The house lights cast steady beams across the yard, illuminating patches of gravel, dry grass, and the wooden posts lining the driveway. Beyond the reach of the lights, the desert receded into darkness. The thieves approached the ranch with unwavering focus. Their vehicle moved slowly along the final stretch of road, as though continuing the same harmless routine they had used days earlier when they posed as driveway workers. They had rehearsed their entry in silence, each man reviewing the sequence of actions that needed to occur with speed and without hesitation. Their plan relied on the moment when the door opened even slightly. They intended to force their way past the threshold, with enough momentum to overwhelm anyone on the other side. They carried weapons not designed for suppleness, but intimidation and control. Their confidence stemmed from the simplicity of their method and the remoteness of the target. They expected no witnesses, no sudden reinforcements, and no immediate pursuit. The foreman heard the vehicle before anyone else noticed the headlights approaching. He glanced toward the window, recognizing the sound of tires on gravel. The arrival seemed unusual at this hour, but not threatening enough to trigger alarm. Visitors sometimes came late, especially those offering services or seeking directions. Inside the house, Vera continued clearing the table, unaware that the strangers had returned. The thieves brought their car to a stop outside the entrance, the engine idling softly as they repositioned themselves for what they were about to do. For a brief moment, the scene appeared ordinary. Three men arriving at a secluded ranch, perhaps with work to offer or questions to ask. The knock that followed was deliberate, firm and designed to compel a response. The foreman moved toward the door, expecting a mundane exchange. As he unlatched the lock, the thieves braced themselves. The instant the door cracked open, all pretense dissolved. The men pushed forward with force, crossing the threshold in a burst of aggression that left the foreman stumbling backward. The confined space of the entryway amplified the violence. The intruders surged into the room with coordinated momentum, creating an immediate imbalance that prevented the occupants from regaining their footing. Vera, startled by the commotion, turned toward the noise as the men swept into the living area. The attack unfolded with speed and physical brutality. One of the thieves seized Vera's hand, gripping it with enough force to immobilize her fingers. The diamond ring that had been a daily presence on her hand became the center of their assault. They pulled at it with a brutality that tore skin and drew blood, wrenching the ring free without concern for the pain inflicted. The stone's metal setting scraped the surface of her finger, leaving behind a raw wound that would later become a critical piece of evidence. The thieves had accomplished the most vital part of their mission within seconds of entering the house. While one man ripped the ring from her hand, the others subdued both victims. They forced the foreman and Vera back to back, binding them with wire stripped from a lamp inside the house. The choice of material was improvised, but effective. The wire bit into their arms, locking their movements and preventing them from attempting escape. The intruders worked with haste, securing the bindings tightly enough to ensure the victims would remain immobilized long after the thieves had fled. The act of binding them with material taken from inside the house reflected the thieves' reliance on environment rather than preparation. Their focus remained on control, speed, and silence. Once the victims were restrained, the intruders moved through the house with singular purpose. They ransacked drawers, searched cabinets, and overturned furniture in their pursuit of additional valuables. They located a revolver, a camera, and a significant sum of cash, approximately $700,000, accumulated in various locations throughout the home. Each item was collected rapidly, placed in bags the men had brought with them, and carried toward the exit. The thieves remained attentive to time, understanding that, even in a remote location, prolonged presence increased risk. They knew that once violence erupted inside a home, the reaction time of victims, no matter how delayed, would eventually shrink the window available for escape. Throughout this chaos, the ranch remained outwardly silent. No neighbors heard commotion, no passerby witnessed the intrusion, and no lights flickered across the desert to indicate distress. The stillness outside contrasted sharply with the violence inside the house. Dust settled undisturbed across the yard. The wind moved lightly through the surrounding brush, and the mountain stood unmoved by the crime unfolding in the valley below. The isolation that had once been considered a sanctuary now amplified the danger. The victims had no way to summon help, and the thieves understood that they had complete control of the environment for as long as they remained. The most pivotal moment of the robbery, the removal of the Krupp Diamond, had already been accomplished, yet the intruders continued searching for additional valuables that could be transported and sold. Their movements were efficient, revealing a familiarity with the patterns of household storage. They checked beneath mattresses, inside wardrobes, and in the kitchen, retrieving items that carried enough value to justify the minutes spent gathering them. Their search was not chaotic, but structured, indicating a level of experience with home invasions that relied on rapid assessment and immediate extraction. Inside the entryway, Vera and the foreman struggled against the wire that held them. The bindings cut into their skin, preventing meaningful movement. They remained positioned back to back, unable to see one another, unable to identify the movements of the men ransacking their home. They could hear drawers opening, objects being displaced, and footsteps crossing the floor. They could feel the vulnerability of the moment, the awareness that escape or resistance was impossible. Every shift of their bodies tightened the wire, deepening the discomfort and reinforcing their inability to act until the intruders left. As the thieves prepared to depart, they took one final precaution. They removed the telephone's battery, rendering the device useless. This ensured the victims would not be able to call for help once freed. The decision reflected their understanding of how isolated the ranch was. Even without telephone access, the victims would still require transportation to reach anyone capable of assistance. This deliberate action added a layer of delay to the response timeline, a delay the thieves believed they needed to escape the region before law enforcement could begin piecing together the events. With their stolen items secured, the men exited the house, leaving the victims bound on the floor. They moved quickly toward their vehicle, loaded their bags, and started the engine. The sound of the car pulling away echoed faintly through the yard, fading into the desert darkness as the vehicle turned onto the gravel road and disappeared behind the bend. The thieves accelerated toward the main road, their headlights cutting through the night. They left behind a house now stripped of its most valuable possessions, and two victims who remained immobilized in the silence that followed. Inside, the aftermath settled in. The violent disruption had ended, leaving only the sounds of heavy breathing and the faint scrape of wire as the victims attempted to free themselves. The foreman struggled first, twisting to test the strength of the bindings. He managed to shift his weight enough to find leverage, gradually loosening the wire until it slipped from one wrist. The process took time, complicated by the awkward positioning and the injuries produced during the struggle. Once he managed to free one hand, he worked quickly to release the remaining bindings, and then turned his attention to Vera. Her hands were swollen and bleeding from the force used to remove the ring. The injury throbbed with sharp pulses of pain, each movement of her hand reminding her of the violence that had just occurred. With both individuals freed, their next priority became locating a means of communication. The telephone lay inoperative, its battery missing, They recognized immediately that they would need to travel to seek help. The foreman retrieved the car keys and assisted Vera toward the vehicle parked outside. Her movements were unsteady, her injured hand cradled against her chest to minimize discomfort. They exited the house, crossing the yard illuminated only by moonlight and the residual glow from the interior. The desert night felt colder now, shaped by shock and urgency. They drove toward Las Vegas, choosing the nearest location where they knew assistance would be available. The airport represented a reliable destination, staffed at all hours and equipped to connect them with authorities. The journey through the dark desert roads felt longer than the actual distance. Every mile carried the weight of the crime that had just occurred, and the uncertainty of whether the thieves remained somewhere nearby. The foreman maintained steady speed, focused on reaching help as quickly as possible, without risking an accident in the low visibility. Upon arrival at the airport, the staff responded immediately to their condition. The sight of a bleeding woman and a shaken ranch foreman signaled the severity of the situation. Airport personnel contacted local deputies, who then responded to the scene and took initial statements. As the details emerged, specifically the theft of a diamond of extraordinary value, the deputies recognized that the investigation would extend far beyond the boundaries of Clark County. The likelihood that the diamond would be carried across state lines meant federal jurisdiction was inevitable. Meanwhile, deputies were dispatched to secure the scene at the ranch. They found the door damaged, the rooms overturned, and evidence of forced entry consistent with the victim's account. The stripped lamp wire used to bind the victims lay discarded on the floor. Traces of blood on furniture and doorways indicated the violence used to remove the ring. Footprints near the entrance revealed the presence of multiple intruders. Every detail recorded at the scene contributed to a growing understanding of the crime's intensity and the thieves' level of determination. By the time the first reports reached law enforcement networks, the thieves were already crossing into the deeper reaches of the desert, putting distance between themselves and the scene of the crime. They moved with urgency, aware that the window of invisibility would soon close. The success of their operation depended on remaining ahead of the response, moving rapidly from one state to the next, and avoiding interactions that might reveal their possession of the diamond. They did not pause to evaluate their actions or reflect on the violence they had inflicted. Their focus remained solely on escape. They moved with urgency, aware that the window of invisibility would soon close. The success of their operation depended on remaining ahead of the response, moving rapidly from one state to the next, and avoiding interactions that might reveal their possession of the diamond. They did not pause to evaluate their actions or reflect on the violence they had inflicted. Their focus remained solely on escape. The night of violence marked the beginning of what would become an interstate manhunt, drawing the attention of the FBI, local deputies, and law enforcement agencies across multiple states. The theft of the Krupp Diamond, combined with the brutality inflicted upon its owner, elevated the case beyond a routine robbery. It became a matter of national interest, a crime defined by its value, its audacity, and its connection to a jewel already known to many. What began as a simple knock on a quiet desert evening had escalated into a crime that would soon ripple across the country. The diamond was gone, its setting torn violently from its owner's hand. The thieves had vanished into the desert night, and the investigation that would follow, driven by federal resources, interstate coordination, and relentless pursuit, was only just beginning. The silence that followed the intruder's departure pressed heavily on the ranch. The immediate violence had ended, but its aftermath carried its own weight. An air thick with shock, disorientation, and the realization that isolation now worked against the victims, rather than for them. Inside the dimly lit house, overturned furniture cast long shadows across the floor. Drawers lay scattered at careless angles, and a lamp stripped of its wire sat lopsided on a side table. The smell of dust and disturbed upholstery lingered. Streaks of blood marked the entryway, where the ring had been torn away, sharp reminders of how swiftly the intrusion had escalated. The quiet was not peaceful. It held the tension of a space recently broken. Vera steadied herself as the foreman guided her toward the door. Each movement of her injured hand sent sharp pulses of pain along her arm. The absence of the weight she had worn for years was immediately, unnervingly apparent. The violence of the act had left the skin swollen and torn, and her hand trembled involuntarily, a physical echo of the assault. The foreman moved with urgency, focused on getting her outside, into a vehicle, and away from a house that had suddenly become a crime scene. Inside, the telephone lay disabled where the thieves had left it, a silent testament to how completely they had controlled the moment. They reached the vehicle parked outside, its metal body reflecting faint moonlight across the hood. The night air was cold, sharper than usual, carrying the stillness of the desert with it. The engine roared to life as the foreman turned the key, headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the beginning of the long road ahead. The ranch receded behind them as they pulled away, becoming a dim outline, swallowed quickly by the desert expanse. The road beneath them was rough, gravel scattering under their tires. As the vehicle pushed forward, neither spoke. Physical reaction had overtaken any attempt to verbalize what had happened. Shock translated into motion, movement toward safety, toward authority, toward any place illuminated enough to counterbalance the darkness they were leaving. The journey toward Las Vegas airport stretched across miles that felt far longer than their actual distance. The desert had never seemed as vast as it did in that drive, its emptiness expanding outward into a void that offered no illusion of security. The headlights reached only so far ahead, revealing short bursts of the road before everything disappeared again into unbroken blackness. The sense of vulnerability persisted. The ranch had been attacked so easily that the entire landscape now seemed complicit in its openness, offering little reassurance until the first lights of civilization became visible in the distance. Las Vegas, despite its late hour, remained active in scattered pockets. The glow of the strip rose faintly above the horizon, a distant cluster of brightness. The airport, though quieter than during daylight hours, remained operational. Its lights shone steadily, marking the runway and terminal areas with geometric precision. As the vehicle approached, the contrast between the desert darkness and the structured illumination provided a sense of refuge. They pulled into the parking area with urgency, the tires grinding against pavement, as the foreman stopped the car and helped Vera toward the entrance. Inside the terminal, their arrival drew immediate attention. A woman whose hand dripped blood and a man whose clothing carried dust and disheveled tension did not resemble typical late-night travelers. Staff members moved quickly, guiding them toward seating and contacting local authorities. The foreman relayed the essential details with the clipped clarity of someone still processing the shock: home invasion, violent assault, valuable property stolen, telephone disabled, escape into the desert. The officials who heard the summary recognized instantly that this was not a routine robbery. The mention of the ring, its size, its identity, its prominence, altered the gravity of the situation. Deputies from Clark County arrived soon after, taking statements while simultaneously preparing to secure the ranch. The seriousness of the crime and the vulnerability of the victims propelled them into immediate action. The deputies radioed additional units, notifying them that a violent home invasion had occurred at a known wealthy property. They instructed Vera to seek medical assistance for her injured hand, arranging for her to be evaluated by a nearby physician. The swelling, bleeding, and tissue damage confirmed the force used in the theft. The injury would become a vital detail in the case, demonstrating both the deliberate targeting of the ring and the brutality employed in removing it. As deputies traveled toward the ranch, the desert night remained indifferent. The headlights of their vehicles created narrow tunnels of visibility along the dusty road, their sirens silent, to preserve the calm while maintaining speed. When the first units arrived, they found the property exactly as described: door damaged, interior ransacked, objects strewn across floors, and the remnants of the wire bindings lying discarded where the victims had been restrained. Officers documented the scene carefully. They noted footprints leading away from the entrance, the marks on the door frame indicating forced entry, and the placement of furniture disrupted during the search. Every detail, no matter how small, would later support the reconstruction of events. One of the deputies found the telephone with its battery removed, confirming the victim's account. Another officer noted the absence of the ring on any surfaces, despite a faint smear of blood on the table, suggesting where it might have been torn from the hand. The stolen cash, revolver, and camera were all listed in the initial report. The deputies worked methodically, knowing that once their documentation was complete, the case would expand beyond their jurisdiction. When a high-value jewel crossed, or was likely to cross, state lines, the investigation automatically escalated to federal interest. By dawn the following morning, the FBI had been notified. The call reached the Las Vegas field office first, where agents immediately recognized the severity of the case. A 33.19 carat D-colored diamond was not merely valuable. It was rare enough that locating it would be significantly easier than concealing it. Its distinctiveness made it both an asset to thieves and a liability. Anyone attempting to sell it risked immediate detection. The diamond's notoriety, already established locally due to Vera's daily wearing, further complicated its potential movement through criminal channels. For FBI agents experienced in interstate theft, the details provided signaled that the thieves would likely travel quickly, attempting to carry the stone through multiple states before stopping. The first federal agents arrived at the ranch shortly after sunrise. They approached the scene with the sober precision that defined mid-century bureau operations. They documented the location of every displaced object, measured the footprints outside the door, and examined the stripped lamp for fingerprints or tool impressions. Agents photographed the scene extensively, capturing evidence from multiple angles. They interviewed deputies to verify the initial findings and began compiling a preliminary timeline of the thieves' movements. Vera, meanwhile, completed her medical treatment and provided a formal statement. Her testimony included descriptions of the intruders, their build, their clothing, their movements, and the method used to restrain her. She detailed the removal of the ring with clinical clarity, recounting the moment it tore free from her skin. Her account offered federal agents crucial insight into the thieves' level of desperation and the deliberate nature of the assault. The FBI recognized that the crime had been targeted rather than opportunistic. By midday, the Las Vegas field office had opened an official case file, later designated HQ 87-46974, identifying the theft as an interstate crime involving substantial value. Notifications were sent to field offices in multiple states, instructing agents to remain alert for any attempts to pawn or transport the diamond. The Bureau began cross-referencing the crime with similar recent cases in the Southwest. Patterns quickly emerged. Several robberies in California and Arizona shared characteristics: small groups of men traveling together, ruses involving maintenance work, and the use of vehicles to escape rapidly across state borders. These connections gave the FBI an initial list of suspects, names known to law enforcement for prior offenses, and suspected involvement in theft rings. One name surfaced repeatedly in these records: John William Hagenson, a fugitive wanted for a similar violent robbery in California. His movements aligned with the timing of the Nevada incident. The descriptions provided by witnesses elsewhere matched the general outlines given by Vera and the foreman. Federal agents determined that Hagenson would become a primary suspect in the search, though they did not limit their investigation exclusively to him. They expected the involvement of additional men based on the physical demands of the crime. As the investigation expanded, the thieves continued their flight from Nevada. They were aware of the need to move quickly, but their escape followed no meticulously planned route. They relied on their ability to cross states with minimal scrutiny, traveling through small towns, highways, and rural areas. Their vehicle blended easily into the stream of late-night traffic on long interstate stretches. In their possession, concealed somewhere within their belongings, lay the diamond, now detached from its owner's hand, carrying with it the evidence of violence and the full weight of federal pursuit. The desert that had once offered them concealment now gave way to a broader landscape of roads, stretching toward California, Arizona, and beyond. Their confidence grew with each mile put between themselves and Nevada. They believed that once enough distance separated them from the ranch, the difficulty of tracing their movements would increase exponentially. They also believed that law enforcement would be slow to coordinate efforts across multiple states. What they did not account for was the diamond's notoriety, the immediacy of federal involvement, and the speed with which the FBI could mobilize resources when a jewel of such significance went missing. Throughout the day, federal agents continued interviewing witnesses and establishing the earliest possible departure time for the thieves. They searched for tire impressions, vehicle tracks, and any identifying features that might narrow down the suspect's direction of travel. The lack of rain preserved the vehicle's tracks in certain areas, but the desert wind had already erased some of the evidence. Agents studied what remained, identifying a general route leading back toward the main highway, a path consistent with the thieves' intent to leave Nevada swiftly. By the end of the first 24 hours, the shape of the investigation had emerged clearly. A violent robbery had occurred at an isolated ranch. A rare diamond with unmistakable characteristics had been stolen. The suspects were likely members of an interstate theft ring, and the crime had already extended beyond state boundaries, requiring a collaborative pursuit involving multiple jurisdictions. The FBI's priority became intercepting the thieves before they could sell or dismantle the diamond. As night fell again over the Nevada desert, the ranch stood quiet once more. The broken door had been secured temporarily. The interior remained marked by the intrusion: drawers open, furniture displaced, wire on the floor, a faint bloodstain on the entryway table. But the center of the crime was gone. The jewel that had once caught the desert sun now moved through an unknown direction, carried by men who had underestimated the force of the investigation that would soon close in around them. The desperation that had defined the victim's escape from the ranch had now transformed into the driving force behind the federal pursuit. The case had entered a new phase, one defined by interstate coordination, rapid intelligence gathering, and the recognition that the theft of the Krupp Diamond would not be resolved through routine methods. It would require relentless tracking, careful inference, and a willingness to follow leads across vast distances. The fugitives had vanished into the desert, but the pursuit had only just begun. Dawn broke over Las Vegas with a muted clarity, illuminating a city that carried on its usual pace, even as federal attention converged sharply on one violent crime in the desert. Within the FBI's Las Vegas field office, agents moved quickly, but without urgency's chaos. Their actions reflected discipline, not haste. The details of the robbery at Spring Mountain Ranch had already begun to circulate internally, and the weight of the case settled over the office like a widening shadow. A 33.19 carat D-color Asher-cut diamond was not an ordinary stolen object. It was an anomaly, rare, distinctive, and nearly impossible to traffic without drawing attention. The ring's notoriety, combined with the brutality inflicted upon its owner, placed the incident at the threshold of high-priority federal operations. Agents began the day by assembling case files, drafting preliminary reports, and reviewing the statements obtained overnight. Vera's account contributed the first layer of clarity. 3 men, a forced entry, immediate aggression, targeted removal of the ring, the disabling of the telephone, and the systematic search of the house. Her recollection of the intruder's physical characteristics offered a starting point, not enough to identify them conclusively, but sufficient to narrow the field of suspects to known patterns of similar crimes. The foreman's statement corroborated her account, reinforcing the timeline and confirming key details about the intrusion. From the outset, the FBI recognized that the crime had not been impulsive. The thieves had approached the property days earlier, under the guise of offering driveway work. They had observed routines, tested the household's response to strangers, and returned at a calculated hour. This behavior aligned with established patterns of certain theft rings, active in the Southwest. These groups relied on mobility, quick escapes across state lines, and the ability to adapt their methods depending on the environment. They did not operate in tightly organized syndicates. Instead, they functioned like drifting constellations of individuals linked by loose relationships, shared criminal histories, and temporary alliances. Agents began analyzing previous cases for similarities. Reports from California and Arizona indicated theft incidents involving small groups of men who posed as maintenance workers before forcing entry. Some of these crimes involved the theft of jewelry, others the targeting of cash or firearms. In one case in California, a fugitive named John William Hagginson had been implicated in a violent robbery that shared striking features with the Nevada crime. He had fled the scene, avoided capture, and was believed to be traveling across the region. His involvement was not confirmed, but his profile resembled the type of individual capable of orchestrating such a theft. While senior agents reviewed suspects, evidence teams arrived at Spring Mountain Ranch to conduct a detailed forensic survey. The ranch stood quiet under the morning light, its exterior appearing undisturbed at a distance. Up close, however, the signs of the attack were unmistakable. Footprints marked the ground near the entrance. The door showed damage consistent with forced entry following the slight opening by the foreman. Inside, the rooms reflected the violence and urgency of the search. Furniture displaced, drawers pulled out, objects scattered. The stripped lamp wire lay coiled loosely on the floor, its missing length an unmistakable indicator of improvised restraints. Agents photographed every angle, measured distances, and collected samples. They dusted the door frame for fingerprints and examined the surfaces of drawers and furniture, though they anticipated limited results. Professional or semi-professional thieves often wore gloves, and even improvised criminals frequently avoided leaving direct contact on metal or polished surfaces. Nevertheless, the FBI processed the scene thoroughly. Any fragment of evidence, partial fingerprints, fabric fibers, boot impressions, might later intersect with information gathered elsewhere. The agents also studied the telephone carefully. The battery had been deliberately removed, an act requiring minimal effort, but significant impact. This detail demonstrated that the thieves were aware of response timelines and intended to delay pursuit. It confirmed a level of planning beyond spontaneous violence. They understood that every minute counted once a crime occurred in such an isolated environment. While the on-site team worked, the field office began constructing a timeline of the thieves' escape. Agents calculated the likely departure time based on the victim's statements, then estimated the distance the intruders could have traveled by car. They plotted possible routes out of the region, identifying roads leading toward California, Arizona, and Utah. Each route presented unique detection challenges. California's proximity made it the most probable direction, especially given the historic movement patterns of suspects like Hagginson. Arizona offered open stretches of highway perfect for rapid travel. Utah's rural expanse, though less populated, provided long stretches with minimal law enforcement presence. The Las Vegas agents contacted neighboring field offices, sharing preliminary suspect descriptions, vehicle characteristics, and the severity of the crime. The notification emphasized the importance of vigilance in tracking attempts to sell or transport a large diamond. Pawn shops, jewelers, and known fences were alerted informally through established relationships. While the thieves were unlikely to approach legitimate jewelers, word spread quickly in the criminal underworld whenever law enforcement began making inquiries. This strategy aimed to narrow the thieves' possibilities and force them into predictable behaviors. Meanwhile, federal analysts reviewed the characteristics of the stolen ring. Its unique Asher cut made it easily identifiable under magnification. The diamond's clarity and color placed it in the uppermost class of jewel grading. Even if the thieves removed it from its setting, jewel experts would have difficulty mistaking it for any other stone. This recognition influenced the FBI's approach. Instead of focusing solely on suspect identification, they focused heavily on tracking the diamond itself. The stone's singularity became the investigation's anchor point. Back at the ranch, agents continued collecting impressions of tire marks near the entrance. And along the dirt road, the consistency of tread patterns suggested a single vehicle, likely the same one used during the thieves' earlier reconnaissance visits. Agents photographed each set of tracks precisely. Tire impression analysis could later match the vehicle, if recovered. While this type of evidence rarely identified suspects alone, it strengthened broader forensic connections. As agents progressed through the property, they also discovered traces of the victim's blood on the entryway table. The pattern matched the description of the ring being torn from Vera's hand. The blood provided physical verification of the force used and confirmed that the ring had been removed violently, rather than surrendered. This mattered for federal classification, because the level of violence elevated the severity of charges, and it reinforced the profile of the suspects as dangerous individuals, rather than opportunistic thieves. By midday, the internal case file was formally designated HQ 87-46974. This classification marked the transition from preliminary assessment to a fully active federal investigation. Experienced agents were assigned to the case, including those specializing in interstate theft rings, jewel tracking, and suspect profiling. The file included the initial narrative summary, crime scene documentation, photographs, and early suspect lists. New information would be added continually, forming the backbone of coordinated pursuit across multiple states. Agents interviewed neighbors and ranch workers, though few had seen anything suspicious. The remoteness of the property made the likelihood of outside witnesses extremely low. A ranch hand who worked nearby recalled seeing unfamiliar men offering driveway work earlier in the week. He had not considered their presence unusual, but the memory now became a critical lead. He described their vehicle, their general appearance, and the direction from which they arrived. This information supported the victim's statements and reinforced the identification of the thieves' method. From this, the FBI constructed a clearer picture of the intruders' reconnaissance. They had used a common trade ruse to gain proximity to the house. Their approach aligned with behaviors observed in earlier crimes attributed to transient thieves who moved frequently between states. These criminals relied on blending into rural labor roles, construction workers, handymen, yard crews, to approach properties without attracting suspicion. The mention of driveway work became a marker, a clue linking otherwise separate cases through shared methodology. In the Las Vegas office, agents cross-checked this detail against reports in Los Angeles, San Diego, and Phoenix. Several incidents in those jurisdictions involved similar approaches. Witnesses in one case described 3 men posing as driveway or roofing workers. In another, suspects used a maintenance ruse to approach rural homes. These parallels strengthened the belief that the Nevada robbery was not isolated, but part of a broader pattern. As afternoon light stretched across the desert, the investigation expanded. Teletypes carried suspect information to field offices across the Southwest. Agents in California began reviewing motel registrations for names matching known fugitives. Louisiana authorities, already familiar with Hagginson, received updated descriptions and were instructed to remain alert for individuals matching his appearance. The FBI's strategy was twofold: track the suspects and track the diamond. Either path could break the case open. In the early phases of pursuit, agents recognized that the thieves' greatest advantage was time. The criminals had gained several hours before law enforcement was notified. In that window, they could have crossed into another state. The highways leading west toward California or south toward Arizona offered uninterrupted travel during that period. The Bureau emphasized rapid coordination, knowing that delays in communication could widen the distance between the suspects and the field offices attempting to locate them. Despite this urgency, the FBI avoided speculative leaps. Their approach relied on building a factual network of evidence and probability. They did not chase every faint rumor or unverified sighting. Instead, they layered details until patterns solidified. The footprint measurements, tire impressions, and witness descriptions combined with regional crime reports to narrow their list of likely suspects. Throughout the day, agents also evaluated the potential for the diamond to be dismantled. Jewel thieves often removed stones from their settings to obscure identification, but in this case, the diamond's unique properties reduced the effectiveness of such a tactic. The FBI coordinated with jewelers in major cities, urging them to be alert for anyone attempting to sell or cut a large, exceptionally clear stone. While the thieves might attempt to conceal the ring, dismantling it risked attracting attention from experts skilled at identifying high-quality diamonds. The Las Vegas office prepared to brief the national headquarters, anticipating that media attention would soon follow. High-value jewel thefts often drew rapid public interest, especially when connected to prominent individuals. Vera's history and the diamond's notoriety meant coverage was inevitable. Once news reached reporters, the FBI aimed to control information carefully, sharing only what was necessary to support the investigation, while withholding details that could compromise operational strategy. As evening approached, agents revisited the crime scene one final time for the day. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across the ranch. The house, though quiet, bore visible traces of the invasion. The disruption of routine, the violence inflicted, and the absence of the diamond created a palpable void. The ranch no longer resembled the refuge it had been. It had become evidence, frozen in the aftermath of aggression. Inside the FBI office, the case file continued to grow. Suspect names were added, cross-state correlations were documented, jewel characteristics were cataloged. Agents prepared travel orders, anticipating movement to other states as leads emerged. Headquarters prepared to issue an official interstate alert. The stage was set, the investigation had direction, the suspects had fled, and the diamond, one of the rarest jewels in private hands, was now moving across unseen highways, carried by men who believed they could outpace the expanding reach of federal pursuit. The manhunt began not with a dramatic chase, but with a meticulous widening of law enforcement vision across the southwestern United States. After the FBI opened case file HQ 87, 46,974, the boundaries of the investigation expanded far beyond the Nevada desert. The theft of the Krupp Diamond, now confirmed as an interstate crime, activated a web of federal coordination that stretched across highways, small towns, major cities, and every informal corridor through which a stolen jewel might pass. Agents understood that the men responsible for the robbery had already gained a critical temporal advantage. Their escape had unfolded in darkness, granting them the precious hours necessary to cross into another state. By the time the first deputies reached Spring Mountain Ranch, the pursuit required not only speed but precision, mapping behaviors, tracing patterns, and predicting the trajectory of fugitives whose movements were shaped by instinct rather than long-term planning. Early leads converged on a list of individuals with histories of similar crimes. The most prominent among them was John William Hagenson, a fugitive with a record marked by violent robberies, multi-state travel, and an ability to disappear across state lines with practiced ease. His profile matched not only the method used in the Nevada robbery, but the psychological composition of someone capable of tearing a valuable ring from an owner's hand without hesitation. In California, he had been wanted for an earlier crime that bore uncanny resemblance to the Spring Mountain incident, an intrusion involving physical intimidation, rushed searches, and a quick escape. While no single detail proved his involvement conclusively, the accumulation of consistencies elevated him from a candidate to a central figure in the developing investigation. With Hagenson as a focal point, agents began reconstructing possible routes he and his accomplices might have used to flee Nevada. The Southwest offered numerous exit paths, each one capable of scattering the group into separate directions if they wished to complicate pursuit. California lay nearest, accessible through highways that rarely experienced heavy nighttime patrols. Arizona's roadways, particularly those stretching toward Phoenix and Tucson, provided long, uninterrupted corridors ideal for fugitives seeking distance. Utah, though less likely based on prior patterns, remained a possibility due to its vast rural terrain. The FBI charted these routes, marking rest points, gas stations, motels, and known criminal safehouses. Agents dispatched teletypes to field offices in Los Angeles, San Diego, Phoenix, Salt Lake City, and beyond. The messages included detailed descriptions of the suspect's likely appearance, approximate height, build, and clothing, as recalled by the victims. They also highlighted the jewel's characteristics: a 33.19 carat Asher cut Type 2, a diamond of rare clarity, flanked by 2 tapered baguettes. If the thieves attempted to sell or modify the jewel, the Bureau wanted every jeweler, pawn shop, fence, and known intermediary under quiet observation. Because the diamond was too distinctive to disappear through ordinary criminal channels, the FBI understood that its recovery depended on anticipating behavior rather than hoping for a lucky break. By mid-April, the investigation extended into California. Agents canvassed motels along the routes commonly used by fugitives moving east from Nevada. They visited establishments in Barstow, Victorville, and Bakersfield, showing photographs of known suspects and asking clerks to recall whether any men matching those images had checked in during the past week. Some workers remembered transient groups, but could not identify faces. Others offered vague descriptions, inconsistent with the case. This was normal. Investigations of this scale rarely advanced through a single dramatic revelation. They progressed through hundreds of small interactions, each adding or eliminating a potential path. Meanwhile, field officers in Arizona pursued similar leads. Reports indicated that a vehicle matching the general description of the suspect's car had been seen near Kingman shortly after midnight on April 11th. The sighting could not be confirmed with certainty, but its timing aligned with the escape window. Agents visited the gas stations along that stretch of highway, checking receipts and speaking with attendants who might remember late-night travelers. Only one attendant recalled a car stopping briefly, driven by men who lingered outside the vehicle, as though debating their next direction. Their purchase, a small amount of fuel and nothing more, suggested that they were conserving resources, likely attempting to avoid unnecessary stops. The pursuit broadened again when additional names surfaced, connected to Hagginson. Intelligence links identified 3 individuals who had been associated with him in previous criminal activities: James George Reeves, Edward Daniel Hay, and William S. Davey. All 3 had records related to property crimes, interstate travel, and involvement with loosely organized theft groups. Their movement patterns suggested familiarity with both California and the Southwest Corridor, extending through Oklahoma and Louisiana. The FBI added these names to the suspect list, updating field offices across multiple states with expanded descriptions and potential aliases. Agents also monitored informal networks, bars known for criminal clientele, boarding houses used by transient workers, repair shops where fugitives might bring a damaged vehicle, and connections within the underworld who occasionally exchanged information for leniency. Informants were contacted quietly, asked whether anyone recently boasted of a violent robbery or sudden acquisition of a valuable item. None had yet heard such claims, but the absence itself told the Bureau something important. The thieves were being cautious, operating with discipline that indicated awareness of federal pursuit. In California, progress accelerated when agents discovered a motel ledger in Bakersfield containing handwriting resembling Hagginson's. The clerk remembered 3 men sharing a room for one night, paying in cash and leaving early. They had offered no identification and made no attempt to appear memorable. Their behavior, though mundane on the surface, matched the survival instincts of fugitives accustomed to avoiding detection. Agents searched the room and surrounding area, but found nothing left behind. Still, the lead confirmed what investigators suspected, that the thieves had indeed crossed into California. As agents traced the suspect's path westward, another piece of information emerged from the criminal underworld. A contact in Phoenix reported hearing that a large diamond had recently surfaced in conversation among a loosely connected group known for facilitating transactions between thieves and buyers. The details were vague, but the timing aligned too closely to dismiss. The informant believed the diamond had not yet been sold or altered, suggesting that the thieves were still weighing their options. This insight reinforced federal concerns that the ring's distinctiveness could make immediate fencing impossible. The suspects might attempt to remove the stone from its setting, but even then, the jewel's unique clarity and size would pose challenges to anyone attempting to cut or disguise it. The FBI recognized that the case could break open at any moment if the thieves made even one miscalculated decision. A single attempt to pawn the diamond, or even to discuss its sale with the wrong intermediary, could trigger a lead. Agents in Los Angeles increased surveillance on individuals known to deal with high-value stolen goods. They visited jewelry districts, spoke with experts in stone cutting, and warned select professionals discreetly to report any unusual activity involving large, unmounted diamonds. The Bureau relied heavily on these soft pressure points, areas where informants, industry insiders, and casual observers often became unwitting contributors to federal investigations. Meanwhile, back in Las Vegas, the case file grew thicker. Agents updated timelines, cross-checked travel patterns, and added new suspects based on interstate intelligence. The investigation became a living structure, breathing, expanding, adapting with each piece of information. Supervisors monitored communications from field offices, directing resources where leads held the greatest promise. Every hour mattered. The longer the suspects remained at large, the greater the risk that the diamond would vanish into foreign markets, where recovery was nearly impossible. One of the most important strategic decisions the Bureau made during this phase involved shifting focus from the diamond to the men themselves. While jewel tracking remained essential, agents acknowledged that apprehending the suspects would ultimately prove the more reliable path to recovering the ring. Individuals like Hagginson had patterns, habits, and weaknesses. They traveled through certain areas, associated with specific types of people, and returned periodically to familiar cities where they believed they could blend in. This predictability, though limited, offered law enforcement a foothold in the otherwise fluid manhunt. As the investigation reached the second week, momentum shifted. A motel clerk in Oklahoma City reported a group of men who matched the suspects' descriptions, staying briefly before departing eastward. They paid in cash, declined housekeeping, and checked out before dawn. This placed them halfway across the country, and moving fast. The Bureau alerted field offices across the Midwest and South, anticipating that the fugitives might continue toward states where they had prior connections. Agents in Louisiana and Texas received updated bulletins, including new intelligence, suggesting that the suspects might attempt to split up to avoid detection. This prediction soon proved accurate. 2 of the suspects were believed to have separated from the group near the Oklahoma-Texas border, traveling in different directions. Such fragmentation made pursuit more challenging, but also increased the likelihood that one group would slip or encounter a situation that generated attention. Fragmentation weakened coordination. Where the thieves once found safety in numbers, they now carried the risk of individual exposure. Each man faced the pressure of carrying knowledge that could implicate the others. The breakthrough came on April 27, 1959, when Louisiana authorities located John William Higginson in a motel in Monroe. Acting on information passed from the FBI, local officers approached the location cautiously. Aware that Higginson had a history of violence, they coordinated quietly with the motel staff, identified his room, and moved in with discipline acquired through experience. The arrest unfolded without the dramatic resistance officials had prepared for. Higginson was taken into custody before he could flee or reach for a weapon. His capture marked the first major turning point in the investigation. Meanwhile, federal agents analyzed the implications. If Higginson had split from his accomplices, then the others were likely still on the move, possibly heading toward the East Coast, or attempting to find criminal contacts in unfamiliar states. During interviews, Higginson deflected responsibility, offering minimal information. His denial of involvement held little weight for agents. Denials were expected, not meaningful. What mattered was the timeline. His capture confirmed that the suspect's path had indeed cut eastward, validating several earlier analytical assumptions about their trajectory. It also elevated the urgency of locating his associates, who now carried the diamond or knowledge of its location. As federal coordination intensified, a clear picture emerged. The suspects had begun their escape through California. They had continued through Arizona and Oklahoma. They had splintered near Texas, and they now moved toward the eastern states, seeking distance and anonymity. The manhunt had evolved from regional pursuit to a sprawling interstate search that required dozens of agents, hundreds of checkpoints, and constant information exchange across field offices. The fugitives believed they could outrun the investigation. The FBI believed momentum was turning in their favor. One side was wrong. The arrest of John William Higginson in Monroe, Louisiana, marked the first fracture in the fugitives' attempt to outrun the widening federal net. His capture did not end the hunt, but it altered its shape. Until that moment, the investigation had been defined by pursuit, tracking movements, analyzing patterns, and mapping possible escape routes. With Higginson in custody, the focus shifted toward extraction, pulling apart the network, isolating each participant, and using information obtained through interrogation, evidence, informants, and interstate coordination to bring down the rest of the group. The FBI recognized that a man like Higginson, experienced in evasion, would not cooperate easily. Yet his apprehension confirmed that the fugitives' momentum had broken. Their flight no longer resembled a coordinated escape, but a disintegration of individuals, moving separately through unfamiliar terrain. Authorities found Higginson in a small, low-cost motel, an establishment selected for anonymity, rather than comfort. His room contained few possessions. The sparse belongings indicated constant movement: clothing, a small bag, basic toiletries, and nothing that suggested a permanent stay. There was no diamond, no ring setting, and no obvious signs of cash, beyond what he might need for immediate expenses. This absence did not surprise federal agents. Professional criminals rarely carried incriminating evidence during interstate flights. What mattered was that the arrest placed pressure on the rest of the group. Each associate still at large now carried increased risk, operating without the security of numbers. In Monroe, Higginson was processed and transferred into federal custody. Agents began preliminary questioning, not expecting confessions, but looking instead for shifts in behavior: hesitation, minor contradictions, or reactions to certain names. His demeanor remained guarded. He denied involvement, deflected responsibility, and insisted he had reached Louisiana through ordinary travel, rather than pursuit. Yet even in his refusals, agents identified inconsistencies tied to his prior movements in California and Nevada. His presence in Monroe aligned too precisely with the fugitive's known trajectory to be coincidence. Investigators documented every detail, adding it to the case file, as they prepared to track the remaining suspects. With Higginson secured, The FBI intensified its efforts elsewhere. Field offices updated their bulletins, informing law enforcement agencies across multiple states that the fugitives were likely splitting or regrouping. The Bureau had long understood that interstate thieves often reacted to pressure by dispersing, hoping that decentralization would confuse pursuit. But this same tactic also exposed them. Individual fugitives lacked the support structures necessary to move undetected indefinitely. They became reliant on unfamiliar territories, risky contacts, and unpredictable decisions. Among the names now receiving federal focus, one stood out prominently: James George Reeves. His criminal history included property crimes, prior associations with known offenders, and patterns of movement consistent with the group's trajectory. Reports indicated that Reeves was both mobile and resourceful. He had connections stretching from California to the Midwest, and his ability to blend into transient communities made him a challenging target. Yet agents believed that pressure from Hagginson's capture would push Reeves towards seeking temporary refuge, likely in a city large enough to offer anonymity, but structured enough to maintain predictable habits. As April progressed into late April and early May, leads converged on the East Coast. In particular, the FBI's Newark office began receiving fragments of information: sightings of men matching suspect descriptions, motel registrations resembling known aliases, and informal tips from individuals aware that federal agents were searching for a multi-state theft ring. Newark, with its proximity to major transportation hubs, became a focal point. The city's dense movement of travelers, its network of low-cost hotels, and its proximity to the New York metropolitan area offered fertile ground for fugitives seeking to disappear temporarily. Surveillance operations began quietly. Federal agents monitored guest lists at several Newark hotels, cross-referencing them with names associated with Hagginson. They watched lobbies, exits, and nearby streets, observing individuals whose habits suggested caution or concealment. Days into this operation, a breakthrough emerged. A tip provided by a hotel staff member, familiar with recent media coverage, described a man matching Reeves's physical appearance staying under a false name. The staff member's recollection included specific details: clothing, approximate age, manner of movement that aligned with federal descriptions. Agents approached the hotel with measured discipline. Their objective was not confrontation but containment. They understood that Reeves might attempt escape if he sensed danger. Surveillance teams positioned themselves at all exits while plainclothes agents entered the lobby. They moved cautiously through the corridors, locating the room registered under the alias, flagged by the tip. Once the hallway was secured, agents knocked, prepared for either flight or resistance. Instead, they encountered a moment of stillness. When Reeves opened the door, the agents acted swiftly, restraining him before he could react. His arrest unfolded with the efficiency of a well-coordinated operation. Inside the room, investigators found a collection of belongings that suggested active travel. Clothing lay folded in suitcases. Personal items were organized neatly. But one detail stood out: a coat that felt unusually heavy. Agents examined it immediately. Within its lining, sewn with care, they discovered a concealed pouch containing the 33.19-carat Krupp Diamond, removed from its original setting. The stone's geometric brilliance remained unchanged despite its rough concealment. Its size and clarity left no room for doubt. Federal agents had recovered the diamond less than 6 weeks after the robbery. The discovery became the turning point of the entire investigation. With the diamond secured, 2 critical objectives had been achieved: identifying the suspects and recovering the jewel intact. The recovery also exposed the structure of the group's movements. The decision to hide the diamond within clothing confirmed the fugitives' fear of carrying it openly, and their acknowledgement that conventional fencing channels were too dangerous. It also evidenced the group's fragmentation. Reeves had separated from his associates and carried the diamond independently, likely intending to wait for conditions safe enough to attempt a sale. The arrest of Reeves triggered a cascade of tactical adjustments. The FBI now believed that the remaining suspects were not operating together. Instead, they were scattered across multiple states. With the diamond in federal custody, agents shifted their strategy toward apprehending the remaining individuals who had participated in the robbery. Evidence obtained from the diamond's recovery, fingerprints on the coat, travel bookings, motel receipts, and personal items, provided new leads. In the following days, agents identified additional suspects: Edward Daniel Hay, associated with both Hagginson and Reeves in earlier crimes; William S. Davey, known for mobility across the Southwest and Midwest; Marion Carter Bowman, connected through criminal circles, believed to have facilitated transportation; Julius Berger, a figure with prior involvement in property crimes and suspected support roles. These names formed the broader network behind the robbery. Each man had played a part, some direct, some peripheral, but all had contributed to the structure that enabled the home invasion, escape, and attempted concealment. The FBI began apprehending them one by one. Some arrests occurred quietly, in towns where the suspects had sought refuge, in the wake of Reeves' capture. Others resulted from coordinated efforts across multiple jurisdictions. The Bureau relied heavily on interagency communication. Sheriffs, local police, state authorities, and federal field offices to corner each individual. None offered resistance significant enough to alter the trajectory of the investigation. With each arrest, the federal case gained structure. Statements from suspects, telephone records, vehicle information, and witness accounts from motels created a layered understanding of how the thieves had traveled after the Nevada robbery. Their escape had been fast but chaotic, lacking the long-term planning necessary for true evasion. Decisions made in haste inevitably left traces, receipts, witness sightings, and inconsistent stories that accumulated into actionable intelligence. While the suspects were processed, the FBI focused on recovering the remaining elements of the ring. The original setting, Sands Diamond, was traced to a jeweler in St. Louis, where the baguette side stones were recovered. This indicated that members of the group had attempted to separate components of the ring to reduce identification risk. Yet even this tactic had failed. The stones were distinctive enough to be recognized once traced back to the jeweler, who had unwittingly handled components of one of the most recognizable jewels in the region. By late May 1959, all major suspects were either in custody or actively sought under arrest warrants. The Bureau had assembled a comprehensive case. The suspects' movements, the coordinated invasion of the ranch, the violence inflicted on the victims, the interstate trajectory of the diamond, and the eventual discovery of the jewel sewn into Rev's coat. Federal prosecutors began formalizing charges, preparing the matter for presentation to a grand jury. The arrest represented more than procedural success. They signaled the collapse of a criminal network that had relied on geographic distance, anonymity, and the illusion of mobility. The sheer distinctiveness of the stolen diamond, combined with the FBI's coordinated interstate pursuit, had closed the fugitives' window of escape long before they realized how thoroughly they were being tracked. The Nevada robbery was no longer a mystery. It was a federal case with named culprits, recovered evidence, and a clear path toward prosecution. A ring that had crossed state after state in an attempt to outrun law enforcement had now been dismantled, piece by piece. The next phase, courtrooms, testimony, indictments, and the unfolding of justice, loomed on the horizon. When federal agents recovered the Krupp Diamond from the lining of James George Reeves's coat, the investigation entered a new phase, one defined not by pursuit, but by consolidation. The jewel's reappearance provided clarity where uncertainty had dominated. It confirmed that the fugitives had separated, that the diamond had been transported across multiple states in improvised fashion, and that the criminals' earlier confidence had fractured into desperation. Yet even as the stone rested in federal custody, the work was far from complete. The FBI still needed to dismantle the remaining threads of the network, identify every participant, and reconstruct the sequence of events that had carried the jewel from a quiet ranch in Nevada to a New Jersey hotel room. The diamond's recovery delivered proof, but the investigation required accountability. The Newark field office became the center of operations in the days following Reeves's arrest. The city's proximity to major transportation hubs, Newark Airport, rail lines, and the port, had turned it into a natural hiding place for fugitives seeking anonymity among transient populations. Reeves had chosen Newark for that reason. He believed the density of travelers and low-cost hotels could mask his presence, providing him time to plan his next move. But the structure that allowed fugitives to vanish also enabled the FBI to conduct targeted surveillance without attracting notice. Observations conducted in busy corridors, lobbies, and bus terminals could occur quietly, blending federal work into the background noise of urban life. Once Reeves was detained, agents began the painstaking process of examining every object in his possession. The coat containing the diamond became a critical artifact, both for its physical evidence and the insight it offered into the thieves' mindset. The stitching inside the lining revealed haste rather than craftsmanship. The pouch was sewn unevenly, suggesting that the concealment had been performed quickly, perhaps under pressure or during travel. The presence of the diamond inside the coat indicated that Reeves was unwilling to trust intermediaries or associates. He had carried one of the world's most valuable jewels against his body for miles, relying only on secrecy and movement as protection. Evidence technicians cataloged fingerprints, fibers, and any other trace material found on the coat. While much of the evidence proved inconclusive due to travel and handling, the garment still offered valuable context. The stitching suggested that Reeves had been alone or with limited assistance at the time of concealment. If multiple suspects had been present, a more sophisticated method might have been used. This detail reinforced the theory that the group had fractured long before the arrest, each man driven by the pressure of evasion and the weight of the crime. While forensic work progressed, Agents at the Newark office reconstructed Reeves' movements. Prior to his arrest, motel staff described him as cautious and distant, avoiding unnecessary conversation, and leaving his room only when essential. He paid in cash, declined housekeeping services, and maintained the room in an orderly state, suggesting readiness to depart quickly, if forced. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses provided limited visual confirmation of his movements, but enough to establish patterns. He often returned before midnight, carrying small grocery bags or newspapers, items purchased to minimize interactions. He had studied the lobby upon entering, as though scanning for potential threats. These behaviors, noted carefully by agents, aligned with those of a man expecting pursuit. As the Bureau reviewed the timeline, it became evident that the fugitives' escape had been shorter-lived than they imagined. Their path from Nevada to the East Coast had spanned less than 3 weeks, an astonishingly fast trajectory given the vast distances traveled. This rapid movement suggested urgency, bordering on panic. The men had not paused to establish stable hiding places or develop long-term plans. Instead, they drifted from state to state, hoping the diamond's value would eventually provide opportunity. But the stone's distinctiveness had worked against them. The fear of attempting to sell it publicly or through criminal networks had prevented its circulation. The fugitives had carried a multi-million-dollar jewel without any realistic path to benefit from it. As Reeves awaited transport to Nevada, the FBI pressed forward in identifying the remaining suspects. His arrest allowed investigators to retrace connections and refine the list of associates involved in the crime. Leads pointed to William S. Davey, Julius Berger, Edward Daniel Hay, and Marion Carter Bowman. Some had direct roles in the robbery. Others served as facilitators, drivers, or handlers during the escape. Their names were added to federal bulletins, their descriptions circulated across field offices, and their known patterns of movement analyzed. The objective was no longer simply to locate them, but to determine how each man fit into the broader structure of the crime. Meanwhile, the recovered diamond underwent authentication. Jewel experts confirmed its precise weight, clarity, and cut. Every hallmark matched the ring worn by Vera at Spring Mountain Ranch. Under calibrated lights, the gem exhibited the characteristic geometric reflections of a Type II Asher-cut diamond. Even after days sewn inside a coat, it retained its brilliance. For the FBI, its recovery also served a legal function. The diamond became a central piece of physical evidence, linking the suspects to the crime. Photographs were taken for trial documentation, and the diamond was secured in federal evidence storage. As the case strengthened, federal prosecutors prepared their strategy. They anticipated that each suspect would attempt to minimize his involvement or deflect blame toward others. But the combination of forensic evidence, witness statements, and travel documentation created a framework difficult to dismantle. The violent removal of the ring, the interstate transport of the jewel, and the coordinated actions of multiple individuals ensured that charges would include not only robbery, but conspiracy, and the interstate transportation of stolen property, offenses carrying significant penalties. While the legal machinery moved forward, the FBI continued hunting the remaining fugitives. Agents tracked Davey to California, where he had been moving between small towns along the freeway. His arrest occurred without incident, the culmination of coordinated surveillance between California officers and federal field agents. Berger was found living temporarily in a rented room in the Pacific Northwest, having attempted to distance himself from the others. He, too, was apprehended without violent resistance. In contrast, Hay and Bowman proved more elusive. Their movements suggested an attempt to stay ahead of law enforcement by shifting between rural areas and cities with limited federal presence. But their histories, marked by previous arrests, known associates, and predictable habits, eventually betrayed them. Agents tracked them to Carson City, Nevada, where they were detained following brief surveillance and tactical coordination. Their arrests completed the chain of suspects involved in the crime, with all principal figures in custody. The FBI focused on consolidating evidence, preparing witness lists, and finalizing the narrative that would be presented in federal court. The case, once defined by violence and uncertainty, now resembled a structured timeline. The reconnaissance at the ranch, the home invasion, the theft of the diamond, the interstate escape, the fragmentation of the group, the recovery of the jewel in Newark, and the arrest of each remaining suspect across multiple states. Yet the Newark arrest remained the defining moment in the investigation. The instant the case shifted from pursuit to resolution, the image of the diamond, sewn awkwardly into the lining of a coat, had become symbolic of the fugitives' unraveling confidence. It reflected haste, fear, and the fundamental miscalculation that they could outrun federal coordination. Every step they took to hide the jewel only drew them deeper into patterns the FBI was trained to detect. In the weeks that followed, the focus turned entirely to prosecution. Federal attorneys assembled their arguments, relying on the combined weight of evidence gathered across the country. Witness testimony from motel clerks, ranch workers, jewel experts, and agents would frame the story, not as a singular act of theft, but as a coordinated conspiracy. The brutality inflicted on Vera, the premeditation behind the robbery, and the calculated attempt to transport the stolen jewels across state lines formed the backbone of the case. The Newark breakthrough had accomplished what weeks of pursuit could not. It provided the physical proof necessary to anchor every other fact. The diamond's recovery validated the victims' accounts, linked Reves directly to the crime, and set the stage for federal indictments that would bring the entire group into court. It also ensured that the jewels' journey through violence and flight would end not in a criminal marketplace, but in a courtroom, preserved, authenticated, and ultimately restored to its rightful owner. As federal agents finalized their reports and prepared for the next phase, the significance of the Newark operation became clear. The city had served as the final hiding place in a chain of movement spanning more than 3,000 miles. A jewel forged under immense geological pressure had passed through shadows, across borders, through stolen vehicles and anonymous motels, only to resurface in a room lit by a single lamp in a Newark hotel. Its recovery closed the distance between the crime and its resolution, pulling the narrative back from uncertainty into clarity. The arrests were complete, the evidence was secure, and the trials, complex, methodical, and shaped by the weight of federal scrutiny, were about to begin. After its discovery, the diamond was transported under strict chain of custody procedures. Federal agents handled it with gloved care, sealing it into an evidence container before carrying it to a secure facility. The stone's weight, though small in physical terms, carried immense legal force. It connected every fragment of the case: the forced entry, the violence inflicted, the interstate escape, the arrests, and the conspiracy underlying the entire operation. Once secured, the jewel was photographed repeatedly under controlled lighting. Its facets shimmered under the lamps, producing crisp reflections that were cataloged for trial. Experts measured and weighed it, confirming each specification against records of the original ring worn daily by Vera at Spring Mountain Ranch. Meanwhile, the ring's two baguette-sized stones, long separated from the diamond, emerged through an entirely different channel. Their recovery occurred not in New Jersey or Nevada, but in St. Louis, where federal agents traced a suspicious transaction to a jeweler who had unwittingly purchased the stones. Their tapered shape, matched with earlier documentation, made them identifiable, even though the original setting had already been dismantled. The jeweler, once informed, cooperated fully, allowing the government to seize the stones and complete the reconstruction of the jewel's components. Though the fragments, diamond and baguettes, were once again under federal protection, the original ring would never fully exist again in its prior form. Its story now preserved in evidence, rather than ornament. The Bureau now possessed the core physical evidence necessary to anchor its prosecution. Yet the work surrounding the diamond's recovery continued. Investigators revisited every location connected to Reves in the days leading up to the arrest. They traced his purchases, his movements, and his interactions. Agents examined the sewing on the coat's interior, its uneven stitching, and hurried construction, determining it had been done by hand, likely in a motel room or similar transitory space. This detail suggested that Reves had not trusted anyone else with the diamond and had concealed it himself, believing proximity offered security that intermediaries could not guarantee. If the diamond had been passed from one fugitive to another during the escape, that exchange had left no clear markers. Reves had been the one carrying it at the time of his arrest, but whether he had held it continuously since the Nevada robbery remained an open question. Some patterns suggested that the fugitives had planned to rotate possession of the jewel to avoid detection, but the disorganized nature of their escape indicated otherwise. More likely, the ring had been carried by a single individual from Nevada to California, and then handed to Reves as the group fractured. Agents reconstructed possible handoff points by comparing their known travel routes with motel records, but no definitive location emerged. Still, the lack of precision did not matter for the trial. What mattered was that the stone had been in Reves's possession, concealed in a way only a guilty participant would attempt. While the diamond remained at the center of federal attention, investigators also worked to recover the broader collection of stolen items taken from the ranch: the camera, cash, and revolver. Some of these items resurfaced quickly, abandoned by suspects who feared being caught with identifiable property. Others remained unaccounted for, absorbed into criminal markets, where cash and small goods moved without traceable history. But the investigators needed only the diamond and side stones to secure the case's core pillars. Everything else though valuable, represented peripheral evidence. The story of the diamond's interstate passage, once reconstructed, revealed the incompatibility between the fugitives' ambitions and their capabilities. They had carried a multi-million-dollar jewel across states, without a single viable plan to profit from it. They had not attempted to cut the stone, or smuggle it out of the country. They had not contacted high-level jewel fences capable of handling illicit luxury goods. Instead, they had relied solely on movement, believing that distance equated to safety. Their assumption proved false. Each mile traveled only drew them deeper into federal networks, trained to trace exactly this type of behavior. The diamond's recovery also reshaped the investigation's narrative in the eyes of federal prosecutors. The crime was no longer simply a violent robbery. It was a conspiracy involving planning, travel, distribution of stolen property, and interstate coordination. The prosecution prepared indictments that reflected this structure, ensuring that charges would cover both the incident at Spring Mountain Ranch and the multi-state transport of the jewel. Inside federal offices in Nevada, New Jersey, and Washington, prosecutors drafted the foundational documents that would guide the grand jury process. Photographs of the diamond, the coat, and the stitching line folders, containing witness statements and forensic reports. The setting recovered in St. Louis was examined under similar scrutiny, its missing stones leaving empty slots that corresponded precisely to the gem now in federal custody. These visual connections served as anchors for the courtroom narrative, allowing jurors and judges to see directly how the fragments of the crime aligned. Meanwhile, agents conducted further interviews with individuals connected to Reeves' movements. Motel workers described the man carrying very little luggage, always scanning areas before entering or exiting. They recalled his preference for rooms away from high-traffic locations and his cautious behavior in public areas. These observations became essential in constructing the psychological portrait of the fugitive, one shaped by suspicion and a persistent awareness of pursuit. The Federal Bureau of Investigation also reviewed informant channels, determining whether any criminal intermediaries had been approached regarding the diamond. In Phoenix, one informant claimed that a rumor had circulated about a large stone in the possession of traveling thieves, but the rumor was vague, lacking specifics, and likely embellished by the nature of criminal storytelling. Still, the mere existence of such rumors reinforced federal understanding that the fugitives had felt immobilized by the jewel's distinctiveness. They could not sell it, could not alter it safely, and could not escape from it. It had become a burden heavier than any material object they had ever carried. The day the jewel resurfaced, the case narrative solidified in a way that no investigative insight alone could have achieved. Every agency involved, the Las Vegas field office, Newark, St. Louis, Monroe, Carson City, and several regional offices, recognized the magnitude of the turning point. The jewel was the crime. Without it, the case remained abstract. With it, the prosecution held not only proof but symbolism, the physical center of a multi-state narrative, the silent testimony of a crime committed at the edge of the Nevada desert. As weeks progressed, federal authorities transported the diamond back to Nevada, where it would be held under strict security pending trial. The route chosen ensured minimal exposure, with federal escorts accompanying the evidence across all transfers. The stone's return mirrored, in reverse, the route of its escape. States crossed, boundaries traversed, custody changed hands, but this time, under federal authority, rather than criminal desperation. In Nevada, the diamond was presented to Vera for formal identification. Her recognition was immediate, despite the trauma of the robbery. The stone's shape, size, and clarity were unmistakable. Its presence evoked both relief and the stark memory of the violence used to remove it. But its recovery symbolized the closing of a chapter that had begun with a knock at her door and unfolded across thousands of miles. Federal agents understood that the diamond's recovery would become one of the most important elements of the trial. It demonstrated intent, possession, and physical connection to the crime. Its journey provided a timeline that aligned with witness accounts, motel records, fingerprint evidence, and arrest reports. In court, prosecutors planned to use the jewel not only as evidence, but as narrative structure, showing the jury how its movement mirrored the suspect's disorganized escape. The recovery of the side stones in St. Louis completed the reconstruction. When viewed together, diamond and baguettes, they formed the visual skeleton of the original ring, offering jurors an understanding of its size and value. Jeweler testimony would later contextualize its rarity, explaining why the fugitives had failed to find a buyer and why the stone had remained intact. As summer approached, and the case prepared to transition from investigation to prosecution, federal agencies coordinated the final transportation of evidence, gathering every document, photograph, witness statement, receipt, and forensic report necessary to support the upcoming indictments. The diamond had resurfaced. The fugitives were in custody, and the courtroom phase methodical, procedural, and shaped by the weight of recovered evidence, was now inevitable. By the summer of 1959, the investigation into the Krupp Diamond theft had shifted fully from pursuit to preparation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had completed its multi-state operation, secured all major suspects, recovered the diamond and its side stones, and reconstructed the events that carried the jewel from a quiet ranch near the Red Rock Canyon to a concealed pocket in Newark. With the arrests finalized and evidence consolidated, the next phase moved into the domain of the federal courts. The theft had crossed state lines, involved coordinated activity among multiple individuals, and centered around a jewel of extraordinary quantifiable value, elements that placed the matter squarely under federal jurisdiction. The stage was now set for a series of trials that would convert investigative findings into legal conclusions. The federal grand jury convened on June 30th, 1959, presenting agents and prosecutors with an opportunity to formalize the charges. The proceedings unfolded inside a Carson City courtroom, where the United States Attorney's Office outlined the structure of the crime: conspiracy, violent robbery, interstate transportation of stolen property, and participation in a multi-state network designed to evade law enforcement. The indictments named 6 individuals: James George Reeves, William S. Davey, Julius Berger, John William Hagenson, Marion Carter Bowman, and Edward Daniel Hay. Each man faced charges not only for the theft itself, but for his role in the broader effort to transport and conceal the stolen diamond across state lines. Grand jury proceedings concluded swiftly. The evidence presented: photographs of the crime scene, reports documenting the recovery of the diamond, witness statements confirming the violence used to obtain it, and the timeline of the suspect's interstate movements, provided more than enough foundation to proceed. With indictments secured, the United States Attorney scheduled the first of 2 trials, dividing the defendants based on their level of involvement and the sequence of their arrests. The justice system now took control of a case that had, until then, unfolded across deserts, highways, and motel rooms. The first trial was scheduled in Las Vegas for November 1959, bringing together Reeves, Davey, and Berger. These 3 men had been linked to the robbery through a combination of evidence, witness testimony, and forensic details. Reeves' arrest in Newark, along with the recovery of the diamond from the lining of his coat, formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. Davey and Berger had played supporting roles during the escape and handling of stolen property, and their presence in the same network supported the conspiracy charges. The defendants were transported to Nevada, under federal custody, escorted by marshals trained in handling interstate detainees. Inside the Las Vegas courtroom, the atmosphere carried the tension of a public event shaped by both crime and rarity. News of the diamond's recovery had circulated throughout the region, and local residents, many of whom had heard rumors of the jewel long before the robbery, followed the proceedings with unusual interest. The courtroom filled daily with observers drawn by the case's dramatic elements: the isolation of the ranch, the violence inflicted, the fugitives' interstate flight, and the reappearance of one of the world's rarest diamonds. The prosecution began by establishing the credibility and consistency of the victims. Vera took the stand, offering clear and concise testimony of the events on April 10th. Her composure underscored the seriousness of the attack. She described the forced entry, the struggle, the moment the ring was torn from her hand, and the subsequent escape into the desert night. The injury, documented in photographs and medical reports, reinforced her account. The foreman followed with his own testimony, corroborating every major detail and recounting the sequence of events that led them to flee the ranch in search of help. Forensic experts then presented their findings. They displayed photographs of the crime scene, diagrams illustrating the forced entry, and images of the lamp wire used to bind the victims. A jeweler testified about the diamond's characteristics, explaining its value, rarity, and unmistakable identity. The prosecution showed the jury the recovered stone, kept in a secure, transparent case, allowing them to witness firsthand the object around which the case revolved. Its clarity under the courtroom lights underscored the improbability that such a jewel could ever remain hidden. Federal agents then mapped the suspects' movements following the robbery. They presented motel logs, fuel receipts, and witness statements from multiple states, constructing a timeline that traced the group from Nevada to California, then to Arizona, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and finally New Jersey. The stitching inside Reeves's coat, photographed and analyzed, was placed before the jury as evidence of hastily improvised concealment. The prosecution emphasized that possession of the diamond, combined with Reeves's presence at the Newark hotel, constituted clear proof of involvement. The defense attempted to separate the defendant's actions, arguing that presence did not imply participation, and that possession of a stolen object did not necessarily connect back to the robbery itself. But the interconnected movements, the evidence recovered, and the testimonies provided a cohesive structure too unified to fracture. The jurors saw the crime as the prosecution intended, not as a spontaneous act, but as a coordinated effort sustained across multiple states. On November 20th, 1959, after days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with guilty verdicts for Reeves, Davey, and Berger. The defendants were convicted on charges related to conspiracy and interstate transportation of stolen property. Their sentencing, scheduled for a later date, marked the culmination of the first phase of the judicial process. The Las Vegas trial had established factual responsibility for the crime and validated the months-long federal pursuit. But the case was not yet closed. A second trial, more complex and more contested, awaited in Carson City. The second trial, held in December 1959, focused on Hagginson, Bowman, and Hay. These defendants had been captured separately and under different circumstances, complicating both the legal narrative and the evidentiary connections. Prosecutors prepared meticulously, organizing their case around the elements that linked the three men to the robbery and its aftermath. Their roles varied: Hagginson as the instigator and primary suspect, Bowman and Hay as facilitators and participants in the broader conspiracy. The Carson City courtroom carried a quieter but more concentrated atmosphere. By this stage, public attention had shifted from the spectacle of the jewel to the procedural conclusion of the case. Yet those who attended sensed the gravity of the trial. The case represented a rare intersection of violent crime, interstate pursuit, federal coordination, and the recovery of a jewel with international attention. The courtroom itself became the final venue in a chain of events that had stretched across more than half the country. Prosecutors began by reconstructing the events of the robbery, repeating the same foundational narrative established in Las Vegas. They presented the testimony of federal agents who described the suspects' movements, their connections to one another, and their involvement in the theft. They emphasized Hagginson's criminal history and his presence on the westward crime circuit before the Nevada incident. Witnesses described similar patterns of behavior in earlier California crimes, patterns that resonated strongly with the Spring Mountain robbery. Bowman and Hay faced charges tied directly to the interstate trajectory of the Diamond and their involvement in supporting the group's movement. Evidence included motel records, travel traces, witness statements, and the recovered ring setting and side stones in St. Louis. Prosecutors highlighted the structure of the escape, demonstrating that none of the suspects could have acted independently. The crime's execution and aftermath required cooperation, even if fragmented later, establishing the legal basis for conspiracy. Defense attorneys attempted to distance their clients from one another. They argued that arrests in multiple states did not imply coordination, and that the defendants' histories with one another did not prove participation in the Nevada crime. They pointed to the absence of direct physical evidence on Bowman or Hay, linking them to the ranch. But the prosecution countered with the broader narrative of interstate transportation, a charge that required only evidence of involvement in the movement of stolen goods across state lines, not physical presence at the robbery itself. Throughout the proceedings, the Diamond remained securely in federal evidence storage. Its presence felt even in the courtroom, as prosecutors referenced it repeatedly. The stone, though not physically displayed at this trial, became a symbolic anchor. Expert testimony reaffirmed its identity, connecting the work of the Las Vegas and Newark field offices to the overarching structure of the case. On December 11, 1959, the jury delivered their verdicts. Hagginson, Bowman, and Hay were found guilty. The conclusion of the second trial closed the primary judicial chapter of the case. All 6 defendants had been tried and convicted in federal courts. Their appeals, some immediate, others filed months later, would prolong their legal battles. But the essential work had been completed. The courts had recognized the robbery for what it was: a coordinated violent crime, carried across state lines, and supported by a loose but functional criminal network. With the trials concluded, prosecutors prepared for sentencing. Judges reviewed the severity of the crime, the violence, the value of the stolen jewel, the interstate escape, and the burden placed on federal resources. Sentences varied based on levels of involvement, prior history, and the weight of evidence, but all defendants faced substantial prison terms. Their convictions stood as a testament to the scope of the investigation and the persistence of the agencies involved. For the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the conclusion of the trials represented the successful end of a case that had spanned 8 states, involved countless hours of field work, and required coordination across regional offices. The case file, once thick with uncertainty, now held clear resolutions, arrests, evidence, testimonies, verdicts, and at the center of it remained the diamond recovered, authenticated, preserved, and ready to return to its rightful owner. But the story's legal complexity was not yet fully resolved. A final chapter awaited. Appeals, reversals, retrials, and the long arc of aftermath that would extend into the early 1960s. The trials concluded the most visible phase of the Krupp Diamond theft. But they did not conclude the legal or historical arc that followed. Federal convictions, even in cases supported by overwhelming evidence, entered a long procedural afterlife. Motions for new trials, appeals, requests for sentence modifications, and the slow process through which convicted men attempted to dismantle the judgments against them. The 6 defendants, spread across multiple institutions, began navigating this system almost immediately. Their efforts unfolded quietly, without the urgency that had defined their interstate flight, but with a persistence shaped by the recognition that legal maneuvering offered their final avenue of escape. In the months following sentencing, attorneys representing several of the defendants filed appeals, challenging procedural aspects of the trials. They questioned the admissibility of certain evidence, the structure of the indictments, and the handling of witness testimony. They argued that the separation of the defendants into 2 trials had created inequities, and that statements made by certain witnesses had influenced jurors improperly. None of these arguments challenged the facts, the violent robbery, the interstate movement, or the recovery of the diamond, but instead focused on technical issues that might offer leverage for retrials or reduced sentences. The courts began evaluating these appeals. In early 1960, most failed quickly. Judges ruled that the evidence presented at trial had been properly admitted, that the jury selection processes had been fair, and that the structure of the trials was justified by the number of defendants and the complexity of the case. But 2 appeals, filed by Marion Carter Bowman and John William Higginson, gained traction not because of their arguments, but because of a procedural flaw that emerged unexpectedly. During the review process, federal judges discovered that portions of the transcript from the second trial, the Carson City proceedings involving Bowman, Higginson, and Hay, were missing. Court reporters in the 1950s relied on stenographic notes that required careful transcription, storage, and verification. In this instance, significant portions of the official record could not be reproduced. Without a complete transcript, appellate courts could not verify whether certain rulings had been made correctly, or whether jury instructions had been delivered in proper form. The absence of these records created a legal vulnerability. On June 20th, 1963, after years of review, a federal court ruled that Bowman and Higginson were entitled to new trials based on the missing transcript. Hay, whose appellate motion rested on different grounds, did not obtain the same relief. The ruling did not question their guilt. Rather, it acknowledged that procedural completeness was essential to upholding a conviction. Without a complete record, the appellate court concluded it could not fulfill its role. The decision reopened a case that federal authorities had considered resolved years earlier. Prosecutors now faced the task of preparing a second trial for Bowman and potentially Higginson. But the passage of time had changed the landscape. Witness memories had faded. Some personnel involved in the original investigation had retired or relocated. Physical evidence remained intact, including the diamond and its accompanying forensic documentation. But the reconstruction of the crime required a renewed investigative effort. As the government prepared for retrial, Bowman remained in custody, maintaining only partial involvement in the conspiracy. Higginson's case, however, took a different trajectory. Lacking strong independent evidence directly linking him to possession of the jewel after the robbery, and facing challenges reconstructing testimony through missing transcripts, the prosecution's case weakened. After the retrial process unfolded, Higginson was ultimately acquitted, his release driven not by doubt about the original charge, but by the limitations imposed by procedural erosion over time. His acquittal underscored the fragility of complex federal cases, when records were incomplete or improperly preserved. Bowman, whose involvement was supported by additional evidence beyond the missing transcript, faced a different outcome. His retrial restored the earlier verdict. The court reaffirmed his role in the conspiracy, and he returned to federal custody to continue serving the remainder of his sentence. The contrasting outcomes for Bowman and Higginson reflected the intricate intersection of law and procedure, where guilt alone did not determine results. Documentation, timing, and administrative precision played influential roles. With the appeals resolved, the case entered a quieter stage. The federal files closed gradually as the convicted men served their terms. For investigators, the matter became one of record rather than active attention. For Vera, the recovery of her ring had restored a sense of security that the robbery had briefly shattered. She resumed life at Spring Mountain Ranch, tending to the property she had built and managing its operations in the desert landscape. She continued to wear the restored diamond ring, its baguette-side stones reset, its clarity unaltered, as an emblem of resilience and identity. The The jewel had endured the journey across half the country, and it returned to her unaltered by the hands that had tried to profit from it. The ranch itself entered a period of calm. Neighbors and workers no longer spoke frequently of the robbery. Time softened the event into memory, but the scars of that night did not fully disappear. The reinforced doors, the new locks, and the subtle changes in behavior reflected a lasting awareness of vulnerability. Vera had lived through the violent removal of her most prized possession, and though the jewel had been restored to her hand, the sense of isolation that once defined the ranch was replaced by deliberate caution. She continued her life quietly, until her death in 1967, closing the chapter of personal stewardship over the diamond. With her passing, the jewel's future no longer lay in the Nevada desert. It transitioned from private ownership to the world of high-profile auctions, where its value, history, and provenance would attract bidders with both wealth and curiosity. After Vera's death, executors prepared her estate for sale. Among the most valuable items was the diamond ring, now famous not only for its size and clarity, but for its history of theft, interstate pursuit, and recovery. Auction houses recognized the unique confluence of rarity and narrative embedded in the jewel. Documents prepared for bidders detailed its origins, craftsmanship, and the federal investigation that had restored it. Its notoriety became part of its allure. The auction took place on May 16, 1968, in New York. Among the bidders was Richard Burton, the actor whose marriage to Elizabeth Taylor had already drawn international fascination. Burton acquired the diamond for a significant sum, presenting it to Taylor, who treasured rare jewels with an appreciation that approached historical study. The diamond entered a new phase of visibility, photographed at events, displayed during interviews, and worn as part of Taylor's celebrated collection. For the first time, the gem's public image overshadowed its criminal past. Even so, the theft became part of its legacy. Writers and journalists revisited the story, recounting the events of 1959 with dramatic detail. The diamond, now worn on red carpets and at film premieres, carried with it the shadow of lamp wire bindings, desert isolation, and the improvisation of fugitives, stitching it inside a coat lining. Its criminal past became inseparable from its cultural presence. After Taylor's death in 2011, the ring returned to auction one final time. At Christie's, surrounded by collectors seeking pieces of film history and rare diamonds, the jewel sold for $8,800,000, a value shaped not only by its gemological qualities, but by the extraordinary arc of its provenance. From a ranch in Nevada to the hands of Hollywood royalty, and once sewn clumsily into the inside of a fugitive's coat, the diamond had traveled through nearly a century of narrative. Its journey illustrated the intersection of wealth, theft, pursuit, and reinvention. It became more than a jewel. It became a chronicle of every hand that ever held it. And though the fugitives who once carried it through the desert and across state lines faded from public record, their actions remained immortalized, not through their names, but through the object they tried and failed to control. With the appeals concluded, the defendants sentenced or released, and the diamond absorbed into modern cultural history, the story of the 1959 Krupp Diamond theft reached its final legal and historical resolution. Only the epilogue remained, the diamond's second life in the world of fame, collection, and legacy. When the legal dust settled, and the final appeals faded into the background of the early 1960s, the Krupp Diamond entered a new phase of existence, one shaped not by fugitives, prosecutors, or federal agents, but by time, inheritance, and the shifting currents of cultural history. Its journey no longer unfolded in the shadows of desert roads or courthouse corridors. Instead, it moved toward the luminous world of estate catalogs, auction houses, and the public fascination with wealth, glamour, and the objects that outlast human lives. The diamond had survived violence, concealment, and interstate flight. It had endured handoffs in motel rooms, clumsy stitching inside a coat, and months hidden from the world. Now it would transition into a chapter defined by visibility rather than secrecy. The first step toward this transformation came in 1967, when Vera, the woman whose quiet possession of the jewel had once drawn the attention of criminals, passed away. Her death marked not only the end of her personal guardianship of the diamond, but the closing of an era. For decades she had worn the ring daily, treating it not only as a piece of jewelry, but as part of her identity. It had been a fixture of her presence at the ranch, glinting in desert light as she moved through the property, appearing in photographs taken by visitors, and lying on the table beside her during evenings spent in the stillness of the Nevada landscape. After the trauma of the robbery, she had continued to wear it with the assurance of someone determined not to let fear dictate the terms of her life. Its journey illustrated the intersection of wealth, theft, pursuit, and reinvention. It became more than a jewel. It became a chronicle of every hand that ever held it. When the legal dust settled, and the final appeals faded into the background of the early 1960s, the Krupp Diamond entered a new phase of existence, one shaped not by fugitives, prosecutors, or federal agents, but by time, inheritance, and the shifting currents of cultural history. Its journey no longer unfolded in the shadows of desert roads or courthouse corridors. Instead, it moved toward the luminous world of estate catalogs, auction houses, and the public fascination with wealth, glamour, and the objects that outlast human lives. The diamond had survived violence, concealment, and interstate flight. It had endured handoffs in motel rooms, clumsy stitching inside a coat, and months hidden from the world. Now it would transition into a chapter defined by visibility, rather than secrecy. The first step toward this transformation came in 1967, when Vera, the woman whose quiet possession of the jewel had once drawn the attention of criminals, passed away. Her death marked not only the end of her personal guardianship of the diamond, but the closing of an era. For decades she had worn the ring daily, treating it not only as a piece of jewelry, but as part of her identity. It had been a fixture of her presence at the ranch, glinting in desert light as she moved through the property, appearing in photographs taken by visitors, and lying on the table beside her during evenings spent in the stillness of the Nevada landscape. After the trauma of the robbery, she had continued to wear it with the assurance of someone determined not to let fear dictate the terms of her life. After her death, the responsibility for her estate fell to executors, who began the formal cataloging of her possessions. Spring Mountain Ranch, with its layered history and collection of artifacts reflecting her years there, contained items of both personal and financial significance. But among all objects in her estate, one stood unmistakably above the rest: the diamond ring recovered by the Federal Bureau of Investigation less than a decade earlier. Its value was known, its provenance was documented in detail, its notoriety, intensified by the robbery, had moved beyond the boundaries of Nevada into national memory. When the executors transferred the jewel to Park Burnett Galleries for auction in New York, it entered a world far removed from the desert ranch, where it had once rested on a bedside table. The auction house prepared for its sale, with the precision reserved for extraordinary objects. Gemologists examined the ring, under magnification, reaffirming the qualities that made it rare even among diamonds of similar size. The auction catalog included a description of its provenance, its weight, its clarity, and the dramatic episode that had nearly taken it from its owner permanently. The narrative of its recovery, woven into the investigation, spanning Nevada, California, Arizona, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and New Jersey, had become inseparable from its presentation. On May 16, 1968, the ring appeared at auction. The bidding attracted international attention, drawing collectors, jewel enthusiasts, and individuals whose interest lay as much in the diamond's history as in its brilliance. Among those competing for the jewel was Richard Burton, who sought it not as a private investment, but as a gift for Elizabeth Taylor, whose appreciation for exceptional jewels had become almost as famous as her film career. Burton secured the winning bid, acquiring the ring for a price that reflected not only its gemological value, but the extraordinary path it had taken to reach the auction block. When Elizabeth Taylor received the diamond, it entered a world defined by visibility, glamour, and relentless public scrutiny. Taylor wore the ring frequently, pairing it with gowns at premieres, showing it during interviews, and including it in photographs that circulated globally. The stone's clarity, which once glinted under the sun at Spring Mountain Ranch, and later reflected motel lamplight during its concealment, now shone under film lights and camera flashes. Taylor admired large diamonds, with a historian's curiosity and a collector's dedication. For her, the jewel represented both artistry and narrative, a product of geological time shaped into an object that carried human stories across continents. Over the years, the diamond became one of Taylor's most recognized jewels. It appeared in magazine spreads, televised events, and images captured during her travels. In these new contexts, the public no longer thought of the robbery or the fugitives who had once carried it across state lines. The ring transformed into an emblem of Hollywood luxury, aligned with Taylor's broader collection of historic stones. It joined a roster that included the Taj Mahal diamond, the Peregrina pearl, and the Burton Taylor diamond, objects that held centuries of history and layers of cultural resonance. Yet the jewel's past did not disappear entirely. Writers, historians, and crime chroniclers revisited the 1959 robbery, analyzing the violent entry, the escape, and the unusual improvised method of concealment. The case entered the annals of mid-century crime history, studied for its interstate scope, the speed of federal coordination, and the unusual fact that such a distinctive diamond was recovered intact. Articles periodically resurfaced, recounting the diamond's theft, its recovery in Newark, and the trials that followed. These accounts preserved the memory of a crime that had once dominated newspaper headlines, ensuring that the fugitives, though long forgotten by most, remained part of the diamond's permanent narrative. As Elizabeth Taylor aged, she continued to curate her jewelry collection with deliberate care. Each piece was cataloged, insured, and documented, reflecting her awareness of the historical value embedded within her possessions. The Krupp Diamond, renamed the Elizabeth Taylor Diamond, occupied one of the most prominent positions in her personal archive. When she wore it, she carried not only its brilliance, but the silent chronicle of every hand, from ranch foreman to fugitive to federal agent, that had intersected with its path. After Taylor's death in 2011, the diamond returned to the world of auctions, entering a setting vastly changed from the one that had hosted its prior sale in 1968. Christie's prepared an event honoring Taylor's legacy, presenting her jewels as an integrated catalog of art, history, and cultural impact. The diamond drew immediate attention, expected to command a price far exceeding its earlier valuations. On the night of the auction, the bidding unfolded in swift increments. Collectors from around the world competed for the stone, driven by both its intrinsic qualities and its connection to Taylor's life. When the final bid was accepted, the diamond sold for $8,800,000, setting records for its category. The sale reflected not merely inflation or gem market trends, but the extraordinary arc of the jewel itself, a trajectory spanning continents, decades, and drastically different worlds. After the auction, the diamond disappeared once more from public view, this time not into the hands of fugitives, but into the private collection of a buyer who chose anonymity. Its future, now shielded from visibility, would unfold in ways unknown to the public. It might someday reappear in another auction house, or remain in a vault as a family heirloom, or be worn quietly by someone who valued privacy over display. Its physical form, unchanged since its cutting, remained constant, but its meaning shifted with each transfer, collecting new associations while retaining the layers of its past. The legacy of the 1959 theft, though no longer dominant in public consciousness, left a lasting imprint on law enforcement history. The case demonstrated the effectiveness of interstate coordination in the post-war era, the importance of forensic precision, and the capacity for federal agencies to respond rapidly to crimes involving high-value assets. It also illustrated the limitations criminals faced when attempting to profit from distinctive objects. The fugitives had possessed one of the most valuable diamonds in private hands, yet lacked the contacts, expertise, and strategic foresight necessary to convert it into money. The stone's size and rarity, which in theory might have enriched them, in practice sealed their fate. Today, the Krupp Diamond lives most prominently in cultural memory, not through the crime that once threatened its disappearance, but through the image of Elizabeth Taylor, wearing it with the confidence and composure that defined her public life. Yet beneath that layer of glamour lies the full chronicle of its passage, from cutting rooms to German industrial circles, from Hollywood to the Nevada desert, from a violent home invasion to the stitching inside a coat, from federal evidence storage to the international stage. It remains, through every chapter of its existence, a vessel of human decisions, ambitions, conflicts, recoveries, and transformations. And though its journey continues beyond the reach of public record, the diamond's second life endures, as a reminder of how an object formed deep within the earth can accumulate the stories of every era it survives.